The first time Caleb Whitmore ever saw Emeline Rourke, she was standing in the rain outside his forge with blood on the hem of her dress that was not her own, and she was asking him, in a voice so quiet he had to lean down to hear it over the hiss of the quenching trough, not to tell anyone she was there. "Don't tell them I'm here," she said, and then she said, "Please." And then she said nothing at all, because her knees had already started to go, and he had already started to move, and by the time he had his arms around her, she had stopped being a stranger asking a favor of a man she'd never met and had become. In some way, he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to himself the only thing in Larkspur Hollow that had felt like it mattered in 3 long years. He did not know her name yet. He did not know what she had done, or what had been done to her, or that within 4 days the peace of his little town would be torn apart by men who had ridden 200 miles to find her. All he knew, standing there in the mud with the rain coming down cold and the forge fire still glowing orange behind him, was that she was afraid in a way he recognized, the specific bone-deep fear of someone who has already been told more than once that no one is coming to help her. And Caleb Whitmore, who had buried his own wife 3 years before and had not let himself feel much of anything since, discovered in that single moment that some part of him had been waiting, without knowing it, for a reason to feel something again. Larkspur Hollow sat in a shallow green bowl of the Colorado high country, a town of perhaps 400 souls tucked between 2 ridgelines thick with lodgepole pine, the kind of place a man could ride through in an afternoon and forget by the time he reached the next county. It had one real street, called Bridge Street, though there had not been a bridge on it in a decade, since the old wooden span over Larkspur Creek had washed out in a spring flood and been replaced by a sturdier stone crossing a half-mile north. Along that street stood the town's modest collection of necessities. Prescott's boarding house, painted a fading yellow that had once been cheerful, the mercantile run by a nervous, kindly man named Ezra Voss, the Larkspur Hollow Methodist Chapel, small and white-steepled, presided over by a young pastor named Elias Cobb, who had come west from Ohio 3 years earlier with more conviction than sense, in his own words. The sheriff's office, presently empty of any sheriff since old Sheriff Purnell had died of a bad heart the previous winter, and the town had not yet found the money or the will to hire a replacement. And at the southern edge of town, where the road bent toward the creek and the tree line thickened, Caleb Whitmore's forge and smithy, a low log building with a lean-to stable behind it, where the ring of hammer on iron had been the town's unofficial clock for as long as most of its residents could remember. Caleb had built that forge himself, or rather rebuilt it, having inherited the original from his father, Amos Whitmore, who had come to the Colorado Territory in the years just after the war looking for land that hadn't been fought over and had found instead a town that needed a blacksmith more than it needed almost anything else. Amos had taught Caleb the trade the way his own father had taught him, hands-on, patient, exacting, and Caleb had grown into it the way a young tree grows into the shape of the wind that's always blown against it, until by the time he was 20, he could shoe a horse, mend a plow, forge a hinge, or repair a rifle with equal unhurried competence. He was 34 years old now, tall and broad through the shoulders in the particular way of men who have spent 2 decades swinging a hammer for a living. With dark hair he kept cropped short for practicality, and a quiet, careful way of speaking that some newcomers to town mistook for coldness, and every longtime resident of Larkspur Hollow knew for what it actually was, which was a kind of grief that had never quite finished healing. He had married Sarah Whitmore, born Sarah Jernigan. When he was 26 and she was 23, a schoolteacher's daughter from Denver who had come to Larkspur Hollow to visit an aunt and had, in Caleb's own retelling of it, ruined his ability to think about anything else within the space of one church supper. They had 4 good years together, 4 years Caleb still measured all other time against, 4 years in which Sarah had transformed the rooms above the smithy into something resembling a real home, with curtains she'd sewn herself and a small garden out back that she tended with more enthusiasm than skill, and a laugh that Caleb could still hear some nights if the wind was quiet enough and he let himself remember it. She had died in the spring of 1881, 3 years before this story begins, of a fever that swept through Larkspur Hollow that year and took 6 people with it, Sarah among them, along with the child she had been carrying, a son they had already, privately, started calling Thomas after Caleb's grandfather. Caleb had buried them both in the small cemetery on the hill above the chapel. Under a single stone he had forged the iron cross for himself, working through 3 nights without sleep because it was the only thing his hands knew how to do with grief that large, and he had not, in the 3 years since, so much as danced with another woman at a town social, let alone courted one. The town had mostly stopped trying to matchmake him by the 2nd year. Agatha Prescott, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the unofficial keeper of Larkspur Hollow's social order, had tried 3 separate times to introduce him to suitable women: a rancher's daughter, a widow from the next county, a schoolteacher not unlike Sarah herself, and each time Caleb had been perfectly polite and perfectly, immovably unavailable, until Agatha had finally declared, with the particular exasperated affection she reserved for him, that she supposed some men simply needed to be struck by lightning before they'd notice they were still alive, and had left him alone about it after that, mostly. He kept an apprentice, a 16-year-old boy named Tobias Lang, called Toby by everyone in town, whose own father had died in a mining accident up near Cripple Creek 2 years back, and whose mother had asked Caleb, with more desperation than she probably wanted to show, whether he might have use for a strong back and a willing pair of hands. Caleb had taken the boy on more out of a sense of obligation to the widow than any real need for help, but Toby had turned out to have a genuine feel for the work, quick to learn, quieter than most boys his age, and over 2 years he had become something between an employee and the son Caleb had never gotten to raise, though neither of them would have used those words out loud. Toby lived with his mother in a small house on the edge of town, but spent more waking hours at the forge than anywhere else. And it was Toby, in fact, who was still there banking the fire for the night on the particular evening in late September of 1884, when everything in Caleb Whitmore's careful, grief-quiet life changed. It had been raining since noon that day, a cold, steady rain that came down out of a gray sky with no particular hurry, the kind of early autumn rain that reminded everyone in Larkspur Hollow that winter was not so far off as they liked to pretend. Caleb had spent the day on unglamorous work, mending a wagon axle for the Kessler Ranch, repairing a broken gate hinge for the Mercantile, the ordinary rhythm of a smith's life in a small town where nothing very large ever seemed to happen. He remembered thinking that evening as he banked the coals with Toby and prepared to close up for the night, that it had been an entirely unremarkable Tuesday, the kind of day that blurred into all the other days behind it. And he remembered, too, the specific, guilty relief he felt at that unremarkableness, because unremarkable days did not ask anything of him that he did not already know how to give. The knock came at the side door of the smithy, not the front, which told him before he even opened it that whoever stood there had walked around from the tree line rather than down the open street. And there was something in the particular hesitance of the knock, 3 soft raps and then silence, that made Toby look up from the forge with the coal shovel still in his hand and say, "Quiet, Mr. Whitmore, that ain't a customer's knock." Caleb had thought the same thing, and some old instinct from the war years his own father had passed down to him without ever fully explaining where it came from, made him tell Toby to bank that fire down low and stay back by the anvil before he crossed to the door himself and opened it. She was standing in the rain without a coat, in a plain gray traveling dress gone dark and heavy with water, her dark hair come loose from its pins and plastered to her face and neck, and she was so pale that for one terrible half-second, Caleb thought she might be a spirit, some trick of the gray evening light, before he saw her chest rising and falling too fast, the particular ragged breathing of someone who has run a long way on very little food, and he saw, too, the dark stain along the hem of her skirt that the rain had not fully washed clean, a stain that no man who had grown up around a forge and a war-scarred father could mistake for anything but blood. She had a small bundle clutched against her chest, wrapped in oilcloth, and her eyes, when they found his in the lantern light spilling out the open door, were the eyes of an animal that has run out of places to run to and has decided, out of sheer exhaustion, to gamble on one more door. "Please," she said, and her voice was so quiet, so carefully controlled even through the shaking, that he understood at once she had spent a long time teaching herself not to sound afraid, even when she very much was. "Don't tell them I'm here. I'll go. I'll go right now if you tell me to. I just need somewhere. Just for tonight. Just until I can think." And that was as far as she got, because her knees folded under her the way a dropped marionette folds, all at once and without warning, and Caleb crossed the distance between them before he had consciously decided to move, catching her before she struck the wet ground, and he would say later, when he tried to explain any of this to Elias Cobb or to himself in the small hours of the following nights, that it was in that exact moment, with her slight, soaked weight, suddenly and entirely dependent on his arms, that something in his chest that had been shut up tight for 3 years came open again, not gently, but the way a door long swollen shut finally gives way under enough pressure, all at once and with a sound like something breaking. Toby had come around the forge by then, coal shovel still absurdly in hand, and said, "Mr. Whitmore, is she—" And Caleb had said, "Get the lamp from the workbench and shut that side door. Quiet, quick." And the boy had done it without further question, some of his own father's old instinct for trouble apparently having passed down to him as well. Caleb carried her not into the smithy proper, where the forge fire threw light out into the yard through the gaps in the shutters, but up the narrow inside stairs to the 2 small rooms above the shop where he had lived alone since Sarah died, rooms that still held in the wardrobe and in a trunk under the bed more of her than Caleb had ever found the courage to clear out. He laid the stranger on the narrow bed in the second room, the room that had once been meant, quietly and privately, for a nursery, and he stood there for a moment simply looking at her, soaked through, shivering, a stranger with blood on her skirt who had just asked him to hide her from someone. And he understood, standing there, that he had already made his decision, had made it, in fact, the instant he caught her, before he knew anything else about her at all. "Toby," he said, when the boy appeared in the doorway with the lamp, "go fetch Doc Ferris, quiet as you can, round the back way, don't say why." And when Toby had gone, moving fast and silent into the rain, Caleb pulled a quilt from the trunk, one Sarah had made in the 2nd year of their marriage, patterned in faded blues and creams, and laid it over the stranger's shivering frame. And only then, kneeling beside the narrow bed with the rain drumming on the roof above them, did he let himself really look at her face and understand that whatever trouble had driven her through the rain to his door, it had not yet finished chasing her, and that he had, in the space of about 90 seconds, made himself a part of it. Doc Ferris arrived within the half-hour, an older man with a gray mustache and the particular unhurried competence of someone who had set more broken bones and delivered more babies in Larkspur Hollow than he could easily count, and he examined the stranger with brisk, careful hands while Caleb waited in the outer room, listening to Toby pace and to the rain finally beginning to slacken outside. When Doc Ferris came out, he had a look on his face that Caleb had seen only twice before in his life, once when Doc Ferris had told him about Sarah's fever, and once when he'd told the Kessler family their eldest boy wasn't going to walk again after the accident with the threshing machine. "She's not hurt bad physically," Ferris said, keeping his voice low. "Exhaustion, mostly. Hasn't eaten properly in days by the look of her, and she's got bruising on her wrists that's a few days old, not fresh, like she was bound at some point and got loose of it. That blood on her skirt isn't hers, Caleb." I checked. No wound anywhere on her body deep enough to account for that much blood. Whoever's blood that is, it isn't hers, and that tells me 2 things, and neither one of them is good. It tells me somebody got hurt bad enough to bleed that much, and it tells me she was close enough to it to end up wearing it. Caleb had absorbed this in silence, the particular silence of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to be doing, and had asked, finally, the only question that mattered. "Is she in danger, Doc, right now, tonight?" Ferris had looked at him for a long moment, the lamplight catching the tired lines around his eyes, and said, "Caleb, a woman doesn't run through open country in the rain with no coat and blood on her skirt because she's had a pleasant week. Whatever she's running from, I'd guess it's still running after her. Question is whether you want to be standing in the way of it when it catches up, because I've known you a long time, son, and I already know what you're going to say, and I want you to say it with your eyes open, not just your heart." And Caleb, who had spent 3 years keeping his eyes very carefully closed to anything that might ask something of him, had said, "I know what I'm going to say, Doc. She stays. Whatever's coming for her, it's going to have to come through me first." She woke sometime past midnight, and Caleb, who had not left the small chair he'd dragged into the doorway of the second room, watched her come up out of sleep the way a drowning person comes up for air, all at once and gasping, her hands already fisted in the quilt before her eyes had even opened. She looked around the unfamiliar room in the low lamplight, the sloped ceiling, the trunk in the corner, the small window with rain still tracking down the glass, and Caleb saw the exact moment she remembered where she was and why, because her whole body went rigid and her eyes found him in the doorway, and for a long, terrible second he watched her deciding whether he was one more danger she'd need to run from. "You're safe," he said, quiet, staying where he was, rather than moving closer. "This is my home, above my forge. You knocked on my door a few hours back, and you fainted dead away before you finished asking me not to tell anyone you were here. I haven't told anyone. Doc Ferris knows, because I wasn't about to let you lie there without a doctor looking you over. But Doc Ferris keeps his own counsel better than any man in this county, and he won't say a word to a living soul. That's the whole truth of who knows you're here. Me, the doctor, and my apprentice, a boy named Toby who's about as talkative as a fence post when it matters." She had stared at him for a long moment, some of the rigidity easing out of her shoulders by degrees, the way ice eases when the sun finally reaches it, and when she spoke her voice was rough, hoarse from disuse or crying or both. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, what I might have done, and you just took me in." "I don't need to know what you've done to know what you looked like standing in my yard," he said. "I've seen frightened people before. My father came back from the war frightened in ways he never talked about. I know the difference between a person running from trouble they made and a person running from trouble that got made for them. You've got the second kind of frightened in your eyes, ma'am. I'd stake my forge on it." She'd started crying then, quietly, without the dramatic heaving sobs of someone performing grief, but the slow, exhausted tears of someone who has been holding herself together through sheer will for so long that the holding itself has become the hardest part, and Caleb had done the only thing he knew to do, which was to bring her water and a little of the bread and cold beef left over from his own supper, and to sit with her in silence until she was ready to either talk or sleep again, whichever came first. Her name, she told him eventually. Between small, careful bites of bread, she seemed to be forcing herself to eat slowly rather than devouring the way her body clearly wanted to, was Emeline Rourke, and she had come from a town called Cross Timbers in North Texas, a cattle town on the edge of the Red River country where her late father had run a modest freight business before his own death 2 years back had left her, at 26, with no family left in the world except a married sister in Missouri. She had not seen in 6 years, and could not, she said with a bitterness that told Caleb there was a longer story buried in that sentence, rely on for anything more than a roof, and possibly not even that. "I was married," she said, and Caleb watched her hands tighten around the tin cup of water as she said it, watched the knuckles go pale, to a man named Silas Draven. He was... She stopped, started again. He was a marshal, federal marshal appointed out of Fort Worth, respected, well thought of by men who never had to be alone in a room with him. I married him 2 years ago because my father had just died, and I was frightened of being alone in the world, and because Silas Draven, when he wanted to be, could be the most charming man in 3 counties. And I did not understand, not until it was far too late to walk it back, that the charm was a tool he used the way another man might use a hammer, deliberately, and only when he needed something from the person he was aiming it at. She had told him then, in pieces, with long silences between the pieces where Caleb simply waited and did not press, about the 2 years of her marriage, and Caleb would think, later, that he had never in his life heard a story told with so little self-pity about a situation that would have justified an ocean of it. Silas Draven had beaten her, not always, not even often in the earliest months, but with an escalating regularity that she had learned to read the way a farmer reads weather, could tell from the set of his jaw at supper whether the night would be a quiet one or not, had learned to keep the house a certain way, to have certain words ready and certain other words carefully unsaid, had learned, in short, the whole silent, exhausting science of surviving a dangerous man by anticipating him before he even knew what he wanted. She had not told anyone, not the 2 or 3 women in Cross Timbers she might have called friends, not the town's minister, not her own sister in her infrequent letters, because Silas Draven was, to every single person outside the walls of their house, a hero, a lawman who had cleaned up 2 counties of rustlers and road agents, a man other men admired and other women's husbands held up as an example, and Emeline had understood, with the particular clear-eyed despair of a woman in her position, that no one in that country would believe her word against his, and that trying and failing would very likely get her killed faster than staying quiet ever would. And then, 4 nights before she arrived at Caleb's door, everything had gone wrong all at once. "I don't," she said, and stopped, and Caleb saw her hands start to shake again, badly enough that the water slopped over the rim of the cup, and he reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and steadied the cup with his own hand until hers stopped trembling enough to hold it alone. "You don't have to tell me tonight," he said. "You don't have to tell me at all if you don't want to. I didn't take you in because I needed a story, Miss Rourke. I took you in because you needed a door that would open." But she told him anyway that night, in a voice gone very flat and careful, the voice of someone reciting something so they don't have to feel it while they say it. Silas had come home 4 nights ago in one of his black moods, worse than she had seen in a long while. Having lost, she gathered later, a considerable sum at cards to a rancher he despised. And he had come at her the way he sometimes did when the black mood was at its worst, and she had done what she always did, which was to make herself small and quiet and wait for it to pass, except that this time it had not passed. This time he had a pistol on the table from cleaning it earlier that evening, and this time, for reasons she still could not entirely reconstruct even to herself, he had picked it up. "I thought he was going to kill me," she said very quietly. "I have thought, many nights before that one, that he might, eventually, in one of the black moods, simply go too far without meaning to stop in time. But that night, he meant to. I could see it in his face, Mr. Whitmore. I have made a study of that man's face for 2 years the way another woman might study scripture, and I am telling you, I saw the exact moment he decided. There had been a struggle, brief and clumsy, and entirely without the choreography such moments have in dime novels. 2 frightened, desperate bodies grappling over a weapon in a lamplit kitchen, and somewhere in the middle of it the pistol had discharged, and Silas Draven, respected federal marshal, terror of 2 counties, had gone down against the kitchen dresser with a wound in his chest that even Emeline, no doctor understood at a glance, was not one a man walked away from, and had died, she said, her voice cracking for the first time in the telling. Died looking up at her with an expression she still saw when she closed her eyes, an expression that was not fear or pain, but pure, outraged disbelief, the look of a man who could not understand, right up to the last second of his life, that the woman he had spent 2 years grinding down might have it in her to fight back at all. "I ran," she said. "God forgive me, I didn't even think, I just ran, because I knew the instant he went down that it would not matter one bit that I never meant it, that it would not matter that 2 years of bruises had come before that one struggle, because Silas Draven had a brother, Otis Draven, who is deputized under him and cut from exactly the same cloth, maybe worse, and I knew Otis would never in 100 years believe that his brother, the great and celebrated Marshal Draven, had raised a gun against his own wife first. I knew the story that would get told in Cross Timbers, and in that story I am not a woman who fought for her life. I am a woman who murdered a lawman in cold blood, and I knew that story would get told with a rope at the end of it, or worse, whatever Otis Draven decided was worse, and I did not stay to find out which. I took what money I had hidden away over 2 years, $4 and some odd coins that I'd squirreled into a hem for exactly this kind of night without ever quite letting myself believe I'd need it, and I took my mother's locket, which is all I have left of her, and I ran. She'd been running for 4 days by the time she reached Larkspur Hollow, hiding in the daylight hours in barns and dry washes, and once, for a terrifying 6 hours, in a stand of scrub brush not 200 yards from a search party she was almost certain had been sent after her, though she could not have said for certain, at that distance, whether it was truly Otis Draven's men or simply cowhands going about their own business. She'd walked more miles than she could count, had traded her mother's locket at a trading post for a little food and the ragged information that there was a town called Larkspur Hollow, 2 days' walk north with a creek running through it, had slept perhaps 6 total hours across those 4 days, and had arrived, finally, soaked and starving and half out of her mind with exhaustion, at the first building on the edge of town that showed a light still burning after dark, which had happened, by whatever accident of geography or fate a person wants to credit, to be Caleb Whitmore's forge. "I don't expect you to believe me," she said when the story finally ran out, her voice gone hoarse and small. "I don't expect anyone to believe me. I've had 2 years to understand exactly how these things get decided, and they get decided by who has the badge and who doesn't, not by what actually happened in a kitchen at midnight." Caleb had been quiet for a long moment after she finished, turning the whole terrible shape of it over in his mind, and when he spoke slowly, choosing the words with the same careful attention he'd give to fitting a difficult joint in iron. "I believe you," he said. "Not because I'm a trusting fool, Miss Rourke, though my sister used to tell me I was exactly that. I believe you because I watched you walk into my yard tonight looking like something that had been running from a nightmare for days, and nightmares don't usually look like that from the guilty end of them. Guilty people run scared of being caught. You're running scared of something that's already caught you once and is looking to catch you again. I've seen the difference before. My own father saw men come back from the war carrying both kinds of fear, and he taught me to tell them apart before I was old enough to shave." She had looked at him then, with an expression he would remember for a long time afterward, something between disbelief and a kind of desperate, cautious hope, the look of a person unlearning, in real time, a lesson that had been beaten into her for 2 solid years, and she had said very quietly, "Why would you risk anything for a stranger, Mr. Whitmore? You have a whole life here, a trade, a town that respects you. Why would you put any of that at risk for a woman you met 3 hours ago?" And Caleb, who had not said this thought out loud to anyone in 3 years, had found himself saying it now, to a stranger, in the lamplit dark of a room that had once been meant for a child who never got born. "Because 3 years ago," he said, "I lost my wife and the son we were going to have, both in the same terrible spring, and I have spent every day since then telling myself that the safest way to live is to want as little as possible. So there's as little as possible left to lose. I've been very good at it, Miss Rourke. Ask anyone in this town. Ask Agatha Prescott, who's been trying to marry me off to every eligible woman within 30 miles for 2 years and gotten nothing but polite refusals for her trouble. I built myself a small, safe, empty life, and I have been living in it very carefully, and tonight you knocked on my door and asked me not to tell anyone you were there. And something in me that I thought had gone quiet for good sat up and said, 'This matters, Caleb. This is a thing that actually matters, and I am done pretending I don't want to matter to anything ever again.'" He had not meant to say quite that much, and he saw, in the lamplight, that it had landed on her with a weight he hadn't fully anticipated, her eyes filling again, though this time the tears seemed different. Less exhausted grief and more something else, something that did not yet have a name between two people who had known each other for less than a night. She had said, finally, "You're a strange kind of stranger, Mr. Whitmore," and he had said, "Folks around here mostly just call me Caleb," and she had said, "Then you'd better call me Emeline if we're going to be strange together," and something had passed between them in that small exchange, quiet and fragile and entirely unspoken, that both of them would recognize much later as the exact moment the whole rest of the story became inevitable. The first problem, once the immediate crisis of that rain-soaked night had passed, was the plain practical one of what to do with a woman who could not be seen in a town small enough that every soul in it noticed a new face within a day and had an opinion about it within 2. Caleb turned the problem over through the small hours of that first night, sitting in the chair by the window long after Emeline had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. And by morning, he had a plan he did not much like, but could not improve on. She would stay in the rooms above the forge, out of sight of the street-facing windows, and the story, if anyone asked, would be that Caleb had taken on a cousin from back east to help keep his house, a widow woman down on her luck, which was near enough to true that he could say it without his voice giving him away, and which explained, conveniently, both her presence and her reluctance to be seen much in public, grieving women being expected, by the unspoken rules of small-town sympathy, to keep somewhat to themselves. The second problem was Toby, who had seen enough of that first night to need bringing properly into the confidence, and Caleb had sat the boy down the next morning in the empty smithy before the day's work started and told him as much of the truth as he judged necessary, that the woman upstairs was running from a dangerous man back in Texas, that her safety depended entirely on nobody in Larkspur Hollow knowing she was there, and that he was trusting Toby with something that mattered more than anything else Caleb had ever asked of him. Toby, who idolized Caleb in the quiet, fierce way boys idolize the first grown man who ever treated them like they mattered, had nodded once, solemn as a church deacon, and said, "I won't say nothing, Mr. Whitmore, not to my ma, not to nobody," and had kept that promise in the days that followed with a discipline that surprised even Caleb, deflecting the mercantile clerk's idle questions about the smoke he'd noticed from the smithy chimney at odd hours, inventing, on his own initiative, a story about Caleb taking on extra work, repairing a rancher's branding irons that required the forge running longer into the evenings than usual. The third problem, and the one Caleb found hardest to solve alone, was that a person cannot survive entirely on secrecy and a blacksmith's limited domestic skills. And by the third day it was clear that Emeline needed more than bread and cold beef and borrowed nightgowns from a dead woman's trunk. She needed proper food, a change of clothes that fit her, and above all, she needed at least one more soul in Larkspur Hollow who could be trusted absolutely, because Caleb could not run his forge, keep up appearances, and tend to a frightened, recovering woman entirely alone without the whole arrangement collapsing under its own strain within a week. He chose, after 2 days of turning the question over, to bring in Agatha Prescott, and he would tell people, much later, that it was the single smartest decision he made in that entire difficult stretch of days. Agatha Prescott was 61 years old, widowed 11 years, built along sturdy, practical lines, with steel-gray hair she wore in a no-nonsense bun, and a tongue sharp enough that half the town was mildly afraid of her, and the other half adored her precisely because of it. She had run the boarding house on Bridge Street since her husband's death, had buried 2 of her own children in childhood the way so many women of her generation had, and had developed, over 61 years of hard living, a set of instincts about people that Caleb trusted more than he trusted most men's considered opinions. He went to her on the 3rd evening, after the boarding house's few guests had retired, and told her everything, start to finish, watching her broad, weathered face for some sign of judgment or fear, and finding instead, by the time he finished, an expression that had gone from alarm to something fierce and entirely unsentimental. "Caleb Whitmore," she said, when he'd finished, "you have gone and done the single most reckless thing I've watched you do in the 11 years I've known you, and I want you to know, before I say another word, that I am prouder of you in this minute than I have been since you were 16 years old and pulled the Kessler boy out of that flooded creek at considerable risk to your own fool neck. Now, what does she need, and how fast can I get it to her without half the county seeing me carry it?" What followed was, by any measure, a small miracle of quiet logistics. Agatha began sending over, under cover of what she described to anyone curious as charitable mending work for the church poor box, a slow trickle of clothing altered to fit a woman of Emeline's slight build, sturdy boots that had belonged to a boarder who'd left them behind and never come back for them, small luxuries like proper soap and a hairbrush that made Emeline cry quietly the first time Caleb brought them up the stairs. Not from the gift itself, but from the sheer unfamiliar sensation, she told him later, of being cared for by people who did not want something from her in return. Agatha came herself, twice in the first week, always after dark, always by the back stair, and sat with Emeline for an hour at a stretch doing nothing more dramatic than talking. About the town, about nothing in particular. The specific, ordinary kindness of treating a hunted woman like a person having an ordinary conversation rather than a problem to be managed. And Caleb watched, in those visits, something in Emeline's shoulders unknot by degrees that his own care, alone, had not quite managed to reach. Agatha, uncharacteristically, cried once herself on the walk back to the boarding house after that second visit, and told Caleb when he walked her partway home out of simple courtesy that Emeline reminded her, more than she'd expected, of her own younger sister, who had married a man in Missouri 30 years back that the whole family had privately worried about and had died young in circumstances the family had never fully discussed even amongst themselves. And Agatha said, with a bitterness Caleb had never heard from her before, "We didn't ask enough questions back then, Caleb. None of us did. It wasn't the fashion to ask a married woman whether her husband treated her right, and I have wondered, more nights than I'd like to admit, whether my sister might have lived a longer life if just one of us had thought to ask. I am not making that mistake twice. Whatever this Emeline needs from me, she has it, and you tell her that plainly because I don't think she quite believes it yet." The fourth soul brought into the secret, a week into Emeline's stay, was Pastor Elias Cobb, and this addition came about less by Caleb's deliberate choice than by simple accident of circumstance. Elias Cobb was 29 years old, lean and earnest in the particular way of young clergymen, who have not yet had all their idealism sanded down by a congregation's ordinary disappointments, and he had come calling at the smithy on a Sunday afternoon on the entirely innocent errand of asking Caleb whether he might repair the chapel's cracked bell mount before the frost set in, and had, through the thin wall between the forge and the stairs, heard a woman's voice, quiet but unmistakably present, asking Caleb a question about supper. Caleb had considered, for one panicked half-second, denying it outright, and had decided instead in the same instant that Elias Cobb was a man whose entire vocation was built around the idea that people deserved mercy more often than judgment, and that lying to him would be both difficult and, in some obscure way, Caleb couldn't fully articulate, a betrayal of what the pastor actually stood for. So he had told him, plainly, the same story he'd told Agatha, and had watched Elias Cobb's earnest young face go through several rounds of shock before settling into something Caleb recognized, having seen it on Elias before, as the particular calm of a man deciding what he believed mattered more than what he'd been taught to fear. "Mr. Whitmore," Elias had said, finally, "I became a minister because I believed, and still believe despite every disappointment this frontier has handed me since, that Scripture asks us to shelter the wronged and confront the powerful. And if half of what you've told me is true, then this woman is exactly the kind of soul the gospel commands me to protect, law of the territory or no law of the territory. I will not tell a living soul. And if it comes to it, if men come asking questions in this town, you tell her she has a place in my congregation's protection that goes beyond what any one blacksmith can offer alone. Because a town, Mr. Whitmore, when it decides to stand together, is a harder thing to move through than a single man standing alone ever could be. It was Elias, in fact, who first raised the question that would come to matter more than any of them yet understood. Sitting in the small kitchen behind the chapel 2 days later with Caleb, turning over the practical and legal shape of the danger Emeline was in. A federal marshal's death, even one that could be shown, given a fair hearing, to be an act of desperate self-defense against 2 years of documented cruelty, was not a small legal matter in the territories, and a marshal's own brother, deputized under him, carried an authority that could reach a very long way if he chose to use it. Further, certainly, than the boundaries of Larkspur Hollow's own quiet jurisdiction, especially with old Sheriff Purnell dead and no replacement yet seated to stand between Otis Draven's badge and whatever he intended to do with it. We need to think, Elias had said, not just about hiding her, Caleb, though God knows that matters for now. We need to think about what happens if hiding isn't enough forever. What happens if this Otis Draven is even half as determined and half as connected as she describes? Because men like that do not simply give up and go home after 4 days of searching, turn up nothing. Men like that widen the search, and Colorado is a very large territory, but it is not in the end. So very large that a determined man with money and a badge cannot eventually think to look in the direction of a quiet little town 200 miles north that happens to sit along one of the more sensible routes a person fleeing north out of Texas might sensibly take. Caleb had not wanted to hear that in the moment, wanting instead to simply enjoy the fragile, precious peace of the days he'd had so far, watching Emeline slowly come back to herself in the rooms above his forge, watching her laugh once, genuinely, at something Toby said about a stubborn mule, watching color return to her face and a kind of cautious light return to her eyes that he suspected had been missing from them for 2 full years before he ever met her. But he had known, even as he resisted hearing it, that Elias was right, and that the quiet days were a loan against a debt that would eventually, inevitably, come due. That debt began to come due on the 9th day, when a stranger rode into Larkspur Hollow on a lathered horse and took a room at Agatha Prescott's boarding house under the name of Jim Colby, a name Agatha reported to Caleb that same evening with her jaw set hard enough to crack walnuts, describing a lean, sun-browned man in his 30s with a lawman's bearing under a rancher's plain clothes, who had asked, over supper, in a voice pitched carefully casual, whether anyone in town had seen a woman traveling alone in the last 2 weeks. Dark-haired, slight of build, likely frightened, likely claiming some story or other to explain herself. A woman, he'd said, wanted for questioning in a serious matter back in Texas. He didn't say murder, Agatha told Caleb that night, standing in the doorway of the smithy with her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. But he didn't need to. Caleb, the way he said serious matter, and the way his eyes went around that dining room like he was pricing every soul in it for what they might know and what it might cost to get it out of them. I told him, same as I've decided to tell anybody who asks, that I run a respectable house and I don't pry into where my boarders have been before they arrive at my door. And that seemed to satisfy him well enough for one evening. But Caleb, that man is not here by accident, and he is not the last one coming. I know that kind of man. My late husband dealt with bounty men and hired trackers his whole career freighting goods through rough country, and that Jim Colby, whatever his real name is, has the exact particular patience of a man who gets paid handsomely for not giving up. In the days after the stranger calling himself Jim Colby arrived, Caleb and Emeline settled into a strange, fragile rhythm that felt, to both of them, uncomfortably close to happiness, a feeling neither one quite trusted enough to name out loud. Emeline could not go out by daylight, could not be seen at the window, could not so much as answer the door if a customer knocked at the smithy's front. But within the narrow confines of those 2 rooms above the forge, she began, slowly, to become herself again. And Caleb found himself arranging his days around small excuses to be near her, bringing her supper himself rather than sending it up with Toby, lingering over the washing up longer than the task required, finding reasons to ask her opinion on matters he had managed perfectly well without anyone's opinion for 3 long years. She had a sharp, dry wit that surprised him the first time it emerged, a week or so into her stay, when Caleb had come up the stairs, grumbling about a farmer named Purdy, who'd argued for 20 minutes over the fair price of a plow repair, and Emeline had listened to the whole complaint with a perfectly straight face before saying, "Well, Mr. Whitmore, it does sound like an absolute tragedy, a man wanting to pay less for excellent work. Whatever will become of civilization?" And Caleb had laughed, a real laugh, loud enough that he'd had to clap a hand over his own mouth, remembering she wasn't supposed to be heard, and Emeline had laughed too, delighted at having provoked it, and something had passed between them in that shared, half-smothered laughter that neither one commented on, but both of them carried around for the rest of that evening, like a small, warm coal held carefully in cupped hands. She began, as the days passed and her strength returned, to insist on being useful over Caleb's initial objections, first mending clothes, her needlework, it turned out, considerably finer than anything Caleb had managed alone in 3 years of bachelor patching, then organizing the small kitchen with an efficiency that made Caleb realize how much of his own domestic life had simply been surviving rather than actually living, and finally, to his considerable surprise, asking whether she might learn something of the forge work itself, not the heavy hammering, she said, practical as ever, but the bookkeeping, the ordering of iron and coal. The ledger Caleb kept in a hand, he himself admitted, was closer to a chicken's scratching than proper penmanship. "You have a fine trade here, Caleb," she told him one evening, the first time she'd used his given name without the formal Mr. attached to it. And he'd noticed, and she'd noticed him noticing, and neither one had remarked on it. "But you are drowning your own books in bad handwriting and worse arithmetic. And if I am going to sit up here doing nothing more useful than mending socks, I would rather make myself worth the risk you're taking on my account. You're not a burden to be worth anything against," he'd said, more sharply than he intended. And she had looked at him for a long moment with an expression he was coming to recognize. The particular careful look of a woman unlearning, piece by piece, 2 years of being taught that her only value lay in what use she could be made to serve. And she'd said quietly, "I know you believe that, Caleb, and some part of me is starting to believe it too, which frightens me considerably more than Otis Draven does some days, because Silas taught me exactly how to survive a man who saw me as a burden. I never learned what to do with a man who doesn't." It was in the 3rd week of her stay that Emeline told him the rest of what she had not been ready to say that first terrible night, the part of the story that lived underneath the pistol and the blood and the kitchen dresser, the part about the 2 years before that final night. And she told it to him on an evening when an early autumn storm was rattling the shutters, and Toby had gone home for the night, and the forge below them sat cold and quiet, and Caleb had the sense, listening, that she was not simply informing him of facts, but setting down a weight she had carried entirely alone for a very long time, and finding, to her own visible surprise, that setting it down did not make her smaller, the way she had perhaps feared, but somehow larger, as though the weight itself had been the thing shrinking her all along. She told him about the first time Silas had struck her, 4 months into the marriage, over something so small she still could not entirely reconstruct what it had actually been. A delayed supper, a misplaced boot, and how he had wept afterward, genuinely wept, she believed, and sworn it would never happen again, and how she had believed him, because she had wanted so badly to believe him, because the alternative, that she had married a man capable of that and there was no fixing it, was a thought too large to hold at 24 years old with no family left to run home to. She told him about the slow, careful process by which she had learned to make herself smaller in the house, to anticipate his moods the way a sailor reads weather, to develop without ever consciously deciding to, an entire second self that existed only inside those walls. Quieter, more careful, more frightened. A self she had hated and needed in equal measure. She told him about the two women in Cross Timbers she had almost confided in, once, and had pulled back from at the last moment both times, because Silas Draven's reputation in that town was so towering, so thoroughly decent-seeming to every eye but hers, that she had genuinely believed, with good reason, that neither woman would credit her word over his. "I used to lie awake," she said, staring at the storm-lit window rather than at Caleb, "and try to imagine what my life would look like if I simply left, just walked away one day while he was at his marshal's work, and I could never make the picture finish. I had no money of my own, no family close enough to reach safely, and in every version of that daydream, Silas found me within a week, because he was a lawman. Caleb finding people was his entire trade, and I understood, the way you understand a fact of weather, that leaving badly would simply mean being found and brought back to something considerably worse than what I was already enduring. So I stayed, and I told myself I was being patient, and some nights I even told myself I was being brave, staying and managing him, rather than making things worse by running poorly. I do not know even now whether that was courage or cowardice, and I have decided these last weeks that perhaps it does not matter which it was, because I am not in that house anymore, and the only question left that matters is what I do with whatever life is left to me now." Caleb had listened to all of it without interrupting, the particular hard-won skill of a man who had learned patience at an anvil, where interrupting the work at the wrong moment could ruin a piece a full day's labor had gone into. And when she finished, he had not offered her comfort in words, not right away because some instinct told him words would feel thin against what she'd just handed him. Instead, he had simply reached over, slowly, the way he'd reached for the water cup that first night, and taken her hand and held it. And after a long moment, she had turned her hand over in his and gripped it back, hard. And they had sat like that for a long while in the storm-lit quiet, saying nothing at all. And it was, Caleb would think much later, one of the most intimate moments of his entire life, more intimate in its way than anything that came after it. Because it was the moment two frightened, careful people decided without a single spoken word to stop being quite so careful with each other. "I want you to know," he said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that he trusted his voice not to shake, "that nothing you've told me changes one thing about how I see you, except to make me admire you a good deal more than I already did, which was already considerable. You did not fail by staying as long as you did, Emeline. You survived 2 years of a war most people never have to fight, and you won it in the end, even if winning it looked like the ugliest, most frightening night of your life. I don't know what happens next, whether Otis Draven finds this town or doesn't, whether the law in this territory would even see it the way I see it if it came to a trial. But I know what I see, sitting across from me tonight. And it is not a murderer, and it is not a burden, and it is not a broken thing that needs fixing. It's a woman who fought for her own life when the whole world had spent 2 years telling her she wasn't allowed to, and I would be a poor excuse for a man if I let her face whatever comes next without somebody standing beside her who sees her exactly that clearly. She had cried again then, but it was. Caleb understood watching her. A different kind of crying than he'd seen from her before. Not the exhausted grief of that first night, nor the slow release of the days after, but something closer to relief, the specific relief of being seen, completely, by another person, and finding that the seeing did not diminish her. And when she had quieted, she had looked at him with an expression that made his own chest go tight and warm at once, and said, "I have spent 2 years being told, in 100 small, silent ways, that I was fortunate a man like Silas Draven had ever wanted me at all, that I ought to be grateful for whatever attention he chose to give me, and I believed some poisoned little piece of that for longer than I'd like to admit. I do not know what it is to be looked at the way you are looking at me right now, Caleb Whitmore, and I find that I am considerably more frightened of it than I was of him, some days, because you cannot break a heart open the way you have just broken mine open and expect it to simply close back up if this all goes wrong. Then we had better make certain it doesn't go wrong, he'd said, and she had laughed, a small, wet, startled laugh, and said, "That's a very large promise for a blacksmith to make against a federal marshal's brother, and however many men he can pay to ride with him." And Caleb had said, "I never claimed to be a wise man, Emeline, only a stubborn one. Ask anyone in this town. Stubbornness has gotten me through worse odds than this, and it has never once had this much reason to try harder than it's ever tried before." The man calling himself Jim Colby stayed in Larkspur Hollow 4 days, asking his careful, casual questions at the mercantile and the livery, and once, memorably, at the smithy itself, where he had come in on the pretext of asking Caleb to look at a loose shoe on his horse, and had spent the better part of 20 minutes making idle conversation that circled, again and again, back to the subject of strangers passing through, women traveling alone, anyone new to town in the last month or so. Caleb had handled it with the same steady, unhurried competence he brought to every difficult piece of iron, answering plainly, volunteering nothing, letting long silences sit unfilled rather than rushing to cover them the way a nervous liar might. And Colby had ridden out on the 5th morning without, as far as anyone could tell, having learned anything of use. But Agatha Prescott, watching him go from her front window, had told Caleb afterward that she did not for one moment believe they had seen the last of that particular trouble. "That man wasn't hunting alone, Caleb," she said. "Men like that don't work alone, not when the prize is worth what I suspect this Otis Draven is offering. He was scouting. Mark me, there'll be more coming, and they'll come with more confidence next time, because Jim Colby, or whatever his true name is, will have told somebody that Larkspur Hollow sits close enough to whatever route she took that it's worth a harder look." Agatha's instinct proved correct within the fortnight. It was Ezra Voss at the mercantile who brought the next word of it, arriving at the smithy in a state of genuine alarm on a bright, cold morning in mid-October, having just come from selling supplies to a party of 4 men who had ridden into town the previous evening and taken rooms not at Agatha's boarding house, but at the rougher establishment on the north edge of town that catered to drovers and men who preferred not to answer too many questions about their business. One of the 4, Voss reported, breathless, had shown him a badge, a deputy's badge out of Texas, and had asked him directly, by name, whether he had ever heard of a woman called Emeline Rourke or Emeline Draven, wanted, the man said, in connection with the death of a federal marshal, and had offered, plainly, a reward of $500 for information leading to her capture, a sum large enough in a town like Larkspur Hollow to turn the head of nearly anyone who might otherwise have no particular loyalty in the matter. Caleb had gone still at that news in a way that frightened Toby, who was present for the telling, more than anything he'd yet seen from his employer, a stillness that was not calm but its opposite, the coiled, controlled stillness of a man deciding, in real time, exactly how much danger had just arrived on his doorstep. "Did you tell him anything?" "Ezra," he'd asked, and Voss, wringing his hands, had said, "No, Caleb, of course not. I told him I hadn't heard the name, which is true enough. I never had heard it before you told me yourself 3 weeks back, and I want you to know I'd cut my own tongue out before I'd sell that woman to men who look at you the way that lot looked at me, Caleb, like they were already deciding what use I might be to them and what threat I might pose if I wasn't. But $500 is $500 in a town like this one, and I won't pretend every soul here has the same feeling about it that I do. There's men in this town who'd sell their own mother's grave marker for considerably less than $500, and you know exactly which men I mean." The leader of the party, Voss reported, was a heavy-set man with cold eyes and a badge of his own, a county sheriff's star from a jurisdiction 200 miles south, a man the others called Sheriff Hargett. And it was this detail, more than any other, that Caleb carried up the stairs to Emeline with a dread he had trouble keeping out of his voice, because when he described the man, Emeline's face had gone the color of ash. "Boone Hargett," she said very quietly. "He's not a real sheriff anymore, not one anybody elected fair, Caleb. Or if he ever was, he sold whatever honesty came with the badge a long time back. He ran with Silas on 2 or 3 matters over the years, matters I was never told the particulars of and learned, eventually not to ask about, and I know for a fact he owed Silas money, a great deal of it from cards mostly. Debts Silas liked to hold over men rather than collect outright because a debt held is more useful than a debt paid. He used to say that to me more than once, like it was a piece of wisdom he was proud of. If Otis has brought Boone Hargett into this, it means Otis is spending real money to chase me. And it means whatever badge Hargett is wearing these days is worth exactly as much as Otis is paying him to wear it in this particular direction, which is to say it will bend however Otis needs it to bend. That is not a lawman looking for the truth, Caleb. That is a debt collector wearing a star, and I am the debt. The 4th man in Otis Draven's party, Emeline told him, matching Voss's description against her own 2 years of unwilling familiarity with her late husband's circle, was almost certainly Otis himself, and this detail settled over the small kitchen above the forge like a physical weight, because Otis Draven, Emeline explained, her voice gone flat and careful in the way Caleb now recognized as her way of managing fear rather than being managed by it, was not a man who delegated matters that touched his family's name directly. He had loved his brother, in whatever twisted, competitive way 2 brothers raised by a hard father sometimes love each other, and he had spent 2 years, by Emeline's account, quietly jealous of Silas's standing, his badge, his marriage, his reputation, and had transformed, the instant Silas died, from a man who might have privately resented his brother into a man consumed with avenging him, because avenging Silas gave Otis, for the first time in his life, a story in which he was the hero rather than the lesser brother standing in Silas's shadow. "He will not stop," Emeline said, "and Caleb, do not mistake this for melodrama. I am telling you plainly what I know to be true, from 2 years of watching that family operate. Otis Draven has spent money he can barely spare hiring trackers and bounty men and a corrupt sheriff to ride 200 miles into a territory where he has no actual jurisdiction, because he has decided that finding me and bringing me back, or simply making certain I never trouble the family name again, is the one thing that will finally make him matter the way Silas always mattered. He is not looking for justice. He is looking for a story where he is finally the man who did something important. And I am afraid, God help me, that makes him considerably more dangerous than his brother ever was, because Silas at least knew what he wanted from me. Otis does not entirely know what he wants. Beyond needing me to be the villain in whatever story he tells himself, and men like that, uncertain of their own purpose, tend to do the ugliest things trying to manufacture certainty. It was Elias Cobb, arriving that same evening having heard his own version of the news from a parishioner, who raised the question none of them had wanted to speak aloud yet, sitting at the small kitchen table with Caleb and Agatha both present, Emeline listening from the doorway of the second room where she still kept carefully out of sight of the front windows even now, weeks into her stay. "We need to decide," Elias said gravely, "what this town is prepared to do if Sheriff Hargett or this Otis Draven comes here directly, to this forge, and asks Caleb outright whether he is harboring her. Because a man wearing a badge, even a badge as corrupted as this one sounds to be, carries a certain weight in the eyes of frightened people, and if he stands in the middle of Bridge Street and declares that Caleb Whitmore is sheltering a fugitive wanted for the murder of a federal officer, some folks in this town who have never had reason to doubt Caleb before will start finding reasons to doubt him now, simply out of the ordinary human instinct to not want trouble like that near their own homes and families. We need more than Caleb's forge standing between Emeline and these men. We need the town itself standing there, or as much of it as we can gather to our side. And Caleb, I do not say this to frighten you further, but I think we are running out of days to gather it quietly." Agatha had nodded slowly at that, Her jaw set in the particular hard line Caleb had learned meant she was already 3 steps ahead in planning something, and said, "I've already begun it, Elias, in my own way. I've spoken careful words to Doc Ferris, who you already know is solid as bedrock on this, and to Manny Kessler out at the ranch, whose boy Caleb pulled from that flood years back and who has never forgotten it, and to old Ferris Dunbar, no relation to the doctor, who runs cattle on the East Range and has his own reasons to distrust any man wearing a Texas badge after some trouble he had with rustling accusations a decade back that turned out to be considerably more crooked than the men accusing him. It is not the whole town, not yet, but it is a start. And every soul I've brought quietly into this has agreed, without exception, that a woman defending her own life against 2 years of brutality is not the criminal in this story. Whatever paper Otis Draven waves around claiming otherwise, Caleb had listened to all of this with a growing cold clarity settling into his chest, the specific clarity of a man who has spent his whole life solving problems with patient, careful work and understands, finally, that this particular problem was not going to be solved that way, that it was going to require, eventually, a reckoning that no amount of quiet planning could fully soften. He looked up at Emeline standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, at Elias's earnest, worried face, at Agatha's fierce, protective certainty, and he said slowly, "Then we had better decide, all of us together, exactly what we're prepared to do. Because I did not take Emeline in 3 weeks ago to hand her over the first time somebody flashes a badge and a reward poster on Bridge Street. Whatever comes, it comes through this town first, and I would rather know now, before it arrives, exactly who is standing beside me when it does." They came to Bridge Street itself on a cold, bright morning 11 days later, 4 men on tired horses, riding at an unhurried pace that Caleb understood, watching from the smithy's open front door, was its own kind of message, the pace of men who believed they had already won and were simply enjoying the last stretch of the hunt. He recognized Sheriff Boone Hargett immediately from Voss's description, heavy-set, cold-eyed, a tin star pinned crooked to a vest that had seen better years, and beside him a leaner, younger man with the particular, restless, aggrieved energy Emeline had described when she talked about Otis Draven, a man who held himself, Caleb thought, like someone perpetually auditioning for a part he did not quite believe he deserved. Toby had gone white as a bedsheet the moment the riders came into view, and Caleb had gripped the boy's shoulder, hard, and said, "Quiet, low. Whatever happens, you know nothing. You've never heard the name Rourke in your life. You go about your work same as any morning." And Toby had nodded, jaw tight, and picked up a length of iron he was meant to be filing, hands shaking just slightly enough that Caleb prayed no one but himself would notice it. The 4 riders drew up in front of the smithy, rather than continuing on, which told Caleb, with a sinking certainty that someone in town had already talked, whether Jim Colby's earlier scouting or simple idle gossip about the widowed cousin nobody in Larkspur Hollow had actually laid eyes on in 6 weeks, and Boone Hargett dismounted first, moving with the deliberate, unhurried heaviness of a large man accustomed to letting his size do some of his talking for him, and said, without preamble, "You'd be Whitmore, the blacksmith." "That's right," Caleb said, setting down his hammer, standing square in the doorway in a way that put his own considerable frame between the street and the stairs behind him without making the positioning look deliberate. "Something I can help you gentlemen with, or are you just passing through?" "Passing through," Otis Draven said, swinging down off his own horse with considerably less composure than Hargett had managed, his voice pitched higher, tighter. The voice of a man running on old grief, dressed up as present purpose. "Looking for a woman. My sister-in-law, as it happens, or she was before she put a bullet in my brother's chest and ran off into open country like the coward she's always been underneath all that quiet, butter-wouldn't-melt manner she showed the world. Emeline Rourke. Goes by Draven, rightly, since she's still legally married to a dead man, whether she likes the sound of that or not. Word reached us she might have come through this territory, maybe even settled somewhere nearby under some invented story or other. You seen a woman fitting that description, Whitmore. Dark hair, slight build, likely claiming to be somebody's widowed cousin, somebody's hired help, something respectable sounding to explain a woman traveling alone with no family anybody locals ever met. Caleb had felt the specific description land, felt the way Otis's eyes had gone deliberately, pointedly toward the second-story windows above the forge as he said it, and understood in that instant that this was not a random inquiry, that someone had indeed talked, or been paid to talk, or simply speculated aloud in the wrong company, and he kept his own face and voice as level as a cooling ingot, the specific stillness he'd learned from 20 years at an anvil, where any sudden movement at the wrong moment could cost a man his fingers. "Can't say I have," he said. "Plenty of women pass through a town on the county road, Sheriff. I don't generally ask them their business, and they don't generally ask mine. I shoe their horses if they need shoeing, and I wish them well on their way. That's the whole of my acquaintance with most folks who ride through Larkspur Hollow." "That's so," Boone Hargett said, and there was something in the way he said it, slow, almost lazy, that made the hair on the back of Caleb's neck rise. The tone of a man who had caught other men in lies before and enjoyed, a little too much, the specific moment just before the lie came apart. "Because we've had word, Whitmore, careful word from a fella who spent a few nights in this town not too long back, that there's talk of a widowed cousin up in these rooms above your shop, a woman nobody's laid eyes on proper in going on 6 or 7 weeks now. Struck him as peculiar, struck me as peculiar too, hearing it. Man keeps a woman living right over his own head, and nobody in a town this size has had so much as a clear look at her face. That's the kind of peculiar that makes a lawman curious, you understand. I've got a cousin recovering from a grief of her own," Caleb said, and felt Emeline's name sitting behind his teeth like a coal he refused to let escape. "And she's not much for company these days, and I don't see that it's any lawman's business how a grieving woman chooses to spend her days, especially a lawman with no jurisdiction I'm aware of in this territory, Sheriff. Colorado's a long way from wherever your badge was issued, unless something's changed since the papers I've seen." Something in Boone Hargett's face had tightened at that. The particular flicker of a man reminded, unwelcome, of the exact legal thinness of the ground he was standing on, and Otis Draven, sensing his own advantage slipping, had stepped forward with his hand resting, deliberately, on the pistol at his hip, and said, "Jurisdiction or not, Whitmore, I intend to see every woman in this town before I ride out of it, starting with whoever's keeping herself so carefully out of sight up there in your rooms. And if you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind me and the sheriff here having a look for ourselves." And it was in that exact suspended moment, with Otis Draven's hand on his pistol and Caleb's own body already beginning, without conscious decision, to shift its weight forward into the doorway in a way that would have put him between Otis and the stairs, regardless of what came next, that Elias Cobb's voice cut across Bridge Street from 20 yards off, clear and pastorally calm, in a way that Caleb would think, later, must have taken considerable nerve to summon on the spot. "Gentlemen," Elias called, walking toward them with his black coat and his collar, and the particular unhurried authority a clergyman can bring to a tense street, even in a rough territory. "Is there some trouble I can help settle here? I couldn't help but overhear talk of searching a private residence without a warrant, which I confess strikes me, even out here on the frontier, as considerably outside the bounds of any lawful process I was ever taught to respect. Sheriff. And I'd be curious to see the paper authorizing a search of Mr. Whitmore's home, if such a paper exists, before this conversation goes any further down that particular road." Hargett had turned to look at Elias with open irritation, but something in the pastor's steady, unhurried presence, and the fact that a small knot of townsfolk had begun to gather at a respectful distance along Bridge Street, drawn by the sight of strange riders and raised voices, seemed to give the sheriff pause, the particular pause of a man who had built a corrupt career on operating just quietly enough that no one ever forced him to produce actual paper for his actions, We don't need paper, preacher. This is a federal matter, a marshal's death. A marshal's death in Texas, Elias said, mild as milk, does not, to my understanding, grant a county sheriff from 200 miles south the authority to search private property in the Colorado Territory, without so much as a telegraphed warrant from a judge with actual jurisdiction here. I'm no lawyer, Sheriff Hargett, but I've sat across a great many disputes in this town over 3 years, and I know enough to know that what you're describing sounds a good deal less like law and a good deal more like intimidation. And I'd ask you, plainly, in front of these witnesses gathering here, whether that's truly the reputation you want, carried back to whatever jurisdiction you actually answer to. The gathering crowd, perhaps a dozen townsfolk by now, had gone very quiet, watching, and Caleb saw something shift in Boone Hargett's cold eyes, a calculation, the specific arithmetic of a corrupt man deciding whether the reward money was worth a public confrontation that might, if it went wrong, draw the kind of unwanted attention that made corrupt men's whole comfortable operations collapse. Otis Draven, less practiced in that particular arithmetic, looked ready to push forward regardless, but Hargett put a heavy hand on the younger man's arm and said, "Lo, not here, Otis, not like this," and then louder to Elias and to Caleb both, "We'll be in town a few days yet, preacher. Plenty of time to do this proper, with paper, if that's what it takes. But I'll tell you this for free, and you can carry it to whoever needs carrying too. A woman's missing from Texas with a marshal's blood on her hands, and money enough riding on finding her that somebody in this town is going to talk eventually, paper or no paper, because $500 buys a great deal of civic cooperation in a town this size, and I've got patience enough to wait for it." They had mounted back up and ridden off toward the North Edge lodging house at an unhurried walk, the same deliberately unbothered pace they'd arrived with, and Caleb had stood in his own doorway with his heart hammering hard enough he could feel it in his throat, watching them go, and had turned to find Elias already beside him and Agatha hurrying up Bridge Street from the boarding house with her shawl flying loose behind her, and the small gathered crowd of townsfolk dispersing slowly, murmuring among themselves in a way that told Caleb the story of this confrontation would be all over Larkspur Hollow by supper, one way or another. "That bought us days," Elias said quietly, once Agatha had joined them. "Not weeks. Hargett's not fool enough to force this in front of witnesses without paper backing him. Not yet, but he'll go looking for that paper now, or worse. He'll go looking for someone in this town willing to swear to something that gives him cause without needing paper at all. We have to assume every hour from here forward is borrowed, Caleb. We need Emeline moved, or hidden better than she's hidden now, and we need it done before Hargett finds whatever crack in this town he's looking to widen." Caleb had gone up the stairs 2 at a time the moment the street was clear, and found Emeline standing well back from the window, having heard, he could tell from her face, every word of what had just happened below, her hands pressed flat against her own chest as though holding something in. And when he reached her, she had not said anything at all, simply stepped into him and held on, hard, shaking, and he had held her back, just as hard and thought, with a clarity that frightened him more than Otis Draven's pistol hand had, that whatever came next, he was no longer capable of imagining a version of his life that did not have this woman standing in the middle of it, and that the fear of losing her, now, had become considerably larger than the fear of grief he had spent 3 careful years organizing his whole existence around avoiding. They moved Emeline that same night, under cover of a moonless sky, and a plan Agatha Prescott had assembled with the brisk efficiency of a general, out the back of the smithy in a hay wagon borrowed from Manny Kessler's ranch, buried under a false floor of loose straw that Caleb had built with his own hands in a single frantic afternoon, 5 miles east to the Kessler spread itself, where Manny and his wife Louisa kept a small line shack at the far edge of their grazing land, used ordinarily for cowhands during roundup season and empty this time of year of anyone but the occasional curious deer. It was Manny himself driving the wagon with Caleb riding alongside on his own horse in the dark, who explained to Caleb, in the low, careful voice of a man settling an old debt, exactly why he had agreed to this risk without a single moment's hesitation when Agatha first came to him. "You already know why, Caleb," Manny said, as the wagon creaked along the dark ranch road. "My boy Danny would be 6 years dead in that creek if you hadn't gone in after him when nobody else moved fast enough, including me, God forgive me, his own father, standing there frozen for the 2 seconds that mattered most. I have spent 11 years trying to find a way to pay a debt like that back properly, and there is no proper way. Not really. A boy's whole life isn't the kind of thing you settle with money or favors. But I'll tell you what I can do. I can hide a frightened woman on my own land from men who have no business hunting her. And if that goes even a little way toward evening what I owe you, then Otis Draven and his bought sheriff can come try their luck on Kessler ground, and they'll find out quick enough that this family doesn't scare as easy as a lone blacksmith in town might. No offense meant to your own considerable nerve, Caleb, which none of us doubt for a second. The line shack was small, rough, drafty in the way of a building meant for seasonal use rather than year-round comfort. But Louisa Kessler had gone ahead earlier that same evening with quilts and provisions and a small iron stove that could be run without much visible smoke, and Emeline, emerging from her straw hiding place stiff and shaking and covered in chaff, had looked around the little shack with an expression that told Caleb she understood exactly what this represented. An entire ranching family risking their own safety and prosperity for a stranger they had met, in Louisa's case, for the very first time that same night. "I don't know how to thank people who don't even know me," Emeline had said to Louisa quietly, and Louisa, a broad, weathered woman not unlike Agatha in her plain, practical kindness, had waved the thanks away with a rough hand and said, "Honey, Manny's told me the whole of what happened to your first husband. Near enough. And I buried a first husband of my own who wasn't half so cruel as what you're describing, and it still nearly broke me for good. So don't you dare thank me for doing the plain human thing here. You rest. You eat. You let this family stand between you and whatever's hunting you, and you don't spend one more minute of your life apologizing for needing help, because needing help isn't a debt. It's just what being alive among decent people is supposed to look like. Caleb could only stay a short while that first night, needing to be seen back at his own forge by morning to avoid drawing suspicion toward the Kessler ranch, and the parting between them, brief as it was, carried a weight neither one tried to disguise. Emeline had walked him out to where his horse stood tethered in the dark and had said, low, urgent, "Caleb, if this goes badly, if Hargett or Otis find some way to make trouble for you specifically, for sheltering me, I want you to understand that you owe me nothing further. You have already done more for me than any person has done in longer than I can remember, and I would rather disappear into open country alone than watch you lose your forge, your standing in this town, everything you've built here, on my account." And Caleb had taken her face in both his hands, gentle as he'd ever touched anything in his life, gentler even than the delicate work of tempering a fine blade, and said, "Emeline Rourke, I buried my wife and my unborn son 3 years ago, and I told myself, standing at that grave, that I would never again let myself want something badly enough that losing it could break me the way that loss broke me. I have spent 3 years keeping that promise to myself, very carefully, very successfully, right up until the night you knocked on my door in the rain. I am done keeping it. I would rather risk everything I've built in this town standing beside you than keep one single stone of it standing alone without you in it. That is not a debt you've placed on me, Emeline. That is simply what has become true, and I would be lying to both of us if I pretended otherwise for one more day." She had kissed him then, for the first time, there in the dark beside his tethered horse with the Kessler ranch house lantern glowing faint in the distance, a slow, careful kiss that carried in it all the fear and hope and hard-won trust of the 6 weeks behind them. And when they finally broke apart, she had laughed, a small, wet, astonished laugh, and said, I did not think I would ever want to be touched by a man again as long as I lived, Caleb Whitmore, and you have gone and proven me wrong about that in the middle of the worst trouble of my entire life, which seems like a very poorly chosen time for my heart to finally come back to itself. And Caleb had said, "My heart didn't ask my permission about the timing either, Emeline. It just recognized something worth coming back to life for, and decided the timing was somebody else's problem to worry about." The days that followed brought a new and different kind of strain, the strain of separation layered over the existing strain of danger. Caleb riding out to the Kessler Line shack only after dark, never on a predictable schedule, always by a different route across open country to avoid leaving a visible trail, while in town itself the situation grew steadily more tense. Boone Hargett and Otis Draven did not leave, as some had hoped they might, discouraged by Elias Cobb's public challenge, but instead settled into Larkspur Hollow with the patient, corrosive persistence of men who intended to simply outlast the town's resistance, spending their reward money freely at the North Edge lodging house, buying drinks for anyone willing to sit and talk, asking their careful questions in a dozen small conversations rather than one large confrontation. And Caleb began to hear, through Agatha and Toby and Elias, the specific names of townsfolk who seemed to be warming slowly to the idea that $500 was a very great deal of money for information that, after all, concerned a woman none of them actually knew. The most troubling of these was a man named Frank Dunmore, who ran the livery stable at the north edge of town and had, Toby reported nervously one evening, been seen drinking with Otis Draven's party on 3 separate occasions in the past week, laughing a good deal louder than the conversation seemed to warrant. And Caleb, who had known Frank Dunmore for 15 years as a perfectly ordinary, if unremarkable neighbor, felt a specific cold dread at the news, because Frank Dunmore, unlike most of Larkspur Hollow, had fallen on genuinely hard times the previous winter when a barn fire took half his stock, and Caleb understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent his own life close to the edge of hard times himself, that desperate men did not need to be wicked to be dangerous. They only needed to be desperate enough that $500 stopped looking like betrayal and started looking like simple survival. Elias Cobb, hearing the same reports, took it upon himself to visit Frank Dunmore directly, a conversation he recounted to Caleb afterward with visible relief mixed with lingering worry. "I didn't accuse him of anything," Elias said. "I simply asked after his family, his barn, how the rebuilding was going, and let him talk. And Caleb, the man is drowning, plain and simple. Drowning in debt from that fire, and too proud or too frightened to ask this town for the help I suspect half of Larkspur Hollow would gladly give him if he only asked plainly, instead of suffering alone. I told him, before I left, that if money trouble was pressing him, the church has a fund, small but real, and neighbors besides who'd rather help a man rebuild a barn than watch him sell out a frightened woman for reward money he'd likely regret taking within the month. I don't know if it took Caleb. I could see him turning it over, but I couldn't in good conscience leave a desperate man in that position without at least offering him a better door than the one Otis Draven was holding open. It was Agatha, in the end, who moved fastest and most decisively, organizing within 3 days a quiet subscription among the sturdier households of Larkspur Hollow. Herself, Manny and Louisa Kessler, Doc Ferris, old Ferris Dunbar the cattleman, several others besides, raising a private sum of just over $400, not quite matching Otis Draven's reward, but close enough, delivered to Frank Dunmore's door by Elias Cobb himself, with no explanation attached beyond a neighbor's helping hand for a neighbor's hard year. And whatever temptation had been building in Frank Dunmore toward Otis Draven's money seemed, in the days that followed, to quietly evaporate. The livery owner's careful, embarrassed gratitude conveyed to Elias in a note that thanked the church and mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd told those Texas fellows he had nothing more to say to them and didn't much appreciate being asked a third time. But even as that particular danger receded, a new one was already gathering, because Boone Hargett, frustrated by the town's stubborn refusal to yield either information or intimidation, had sent word. Caleb learned from a rider passing through with mail from the county seat to a territorial judge 2 days' ride south, requesting an expedited warrant on the strength of an affidavit he claimed to have secured from an unnamed witness in Larkspur Hollow. And Caleb understood, hearing this, with a dread that settled into his stomach like cold iron, that whether or not Hargett's affidavit was built on truth or simple manufactured convenience, a warrant, once granted, would give Otis Draven exactly the legal cover he had been lacking to search every building in Larkspur Hollow, including eventually, however carefully hidden, a line shack on Kessler Ranch land 5 miles east of town. The warrant arrived on the 16th day since Otis Draven and Boone Hargett had first ridden into Larkspur Hollow, carried by a territorial deputy who rode in tired and dust-covered from the 2-day journey south, and word of it reached Caleb within the hour through Doc Ferris, who had been at the Mercantile when the deputy stopped to ask directions to the sheriff's empty office, a detail that struck Doc Ferris as almost comically fitting, that a warrant meant to search a town for a fugitive should arrive to find that same town still without a lawful sheriff of its own to receive it properly. The warrant, Doc Ferris reported, breathless from hurrying to the smithy, was narrower than Caleb had feared, but still dangerous enough, authorizing a search specifically of Caleb Whitmore's property, the forge and the rooms above it, on the strength of a sworn affidavit from a witness identified only as a concerned citizen of Larkspur Hollow, who claimed direct knowledge that Whitmore had been harboring a woman matching Emeline Rourke's description for a period of several weeks. It did not notably extend to the Kessler Ranch, a fact that told Caleb someone had talked, but had talked only about what they actually knew or suspected, the widowed cousin story that had circulated through town gossip, rather than anything about the later, better-hidden move to the line shack, which meant, at least, that whoever had given the affidavit was working from town rumor rather than genuine inside knowledge of Emeline's actual whereabouts. Caleb had felt a strange, cold relief at that detail even amid the larger alarm, because it meant Emeline herself remained safe for the moment. But it also meant that his own forge, his own home, the physical evidence of 6 weeks of a woman's presence, however carefully he and Toby had worked to erase it after her move to the Kessler Ranch, 3 days hence was going to be searched by men with legal standing to search it. And Caleb understood, moving quickly through the rooms above the smithy that same afternoon with Toby's help, that some evidence simply could not be erased entirely. A second toothbrush, a woman's altered dress hanging forgotten at the back of the wardrobe, the specific rearrangement of furniture that suggested 2 people living where one had lived alone for 3 years. It was Elias Cobb, arriving breathless with the same news from a different direction, who raised the question that mattered most in that frantic afternoon. "Caleb," he said, "we cannot unring this bell entirely, not with 3 days until they search, but we can decide together how to meet it. And I think the wisest course is not to hide every trace and hope they find nothing, because if they find nothing at all after such a specific affidavit, Hargett will simply conclude she was moved, and redouble his search of the wider county with a warrant now proven, in his eyes, to have been accurate in its particulars. I think instead we should let them find exactly enough to confirm she was here, and no more. A story we control rather than a story they discover piece by piece and interpret however suits them worst." The story they settled on, worked out over that long, tense afternoon between Caleb, Elias, and Agatha, was close enough to true to hold up under any pressure Hargett might apply, and different enough in its ending to protect what mattered most. Yes, Caleb would say, if pressed, a woman matching that description had indeed stayed briefly in his home, a stranger who had arrived injured and frightened weeks before, whom he had sheltered out of simple Christian charity without at first knowing her full history, and who had, upon growing well enough to travel and understanding the danger gathering around her, moved on from Larkspur Hollow entirely, heading, Caleb would suggest, vaguely northwest, toward the mining camps and the more lawless, harder-to-search country beyond, a direction plausible enough to send Hargot's search wide and thin across genuinely difficult terrain, buying time even if it did not fully satisfy him. It is not a lie built to hold forever, Elias had cautioned, but it may hold long enough, and long enough, Caleb, in a situation like this, is very often the only kind of victory available to us. We are not trying to defeat these men outright. We are trying to outlast their patience and their money, both of which are finite, however frightening they seem today. The search itself, when it came 3 days later, was carried out by Boone Hargot personally, accompanied by the territorial deputy who had delivered the warrant, and at a distance, watching from horseback with an expression of barely contained impatience, Otis Draven, who had been informed, over his own loud objection, that the warrant named Whitmore's property specifically and that his own presence inside during the search itself would not be permitted, a small procedural mercy that Caleb suspected had more to do with the territorial deputy's professional caution than any genuine restraint on Hargot's part. Caleb stood in his own doorway and watched Hargot's men go through his home with methodical, unhurried thoroughness, watched the sheriff's cold eyes catch on the second toothbrush, the altered dress, the rearranged furniture, watched him absorb each small piece of evidence with the particular satisfaction of a man confirming a suspicion he had already privately settled. And when the search concluded, an hour later, Hargot had stood in the yard with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt and said, "Well, Whitmore, seems you had yourself a guest here after all. Whatever story you were telling 3 weeks back about a grieving cousin nobody in town had laid eyes on." "I never said I didn't have a guest, Sheriff," Caleb had replied, steady as he could manage. "I said I hadn't seen the woman you described, and that was true enough at the time you asked it, because at the time you first rode into this town, she was already gone from here, had been for the better part of 2 weeks. Woman came through injured and frightened. I gave her shelter, same as I'd give any soul in that condition, same as Scripture and plain decency both ask of a man, and once she was well enough to travel and understood there was trouble following her, she thanked me and moved on. Didn't tell me where, and I didn't ask, figuring a frightened woman's business was her own to keep private, same as I'd want mine kept if our positions were reversed." "Which direction?" Hargot had pressed, and Caleb had said, watched him ride out toward the northwest trail. "Myself, 3 weeks back near enough, though I couldn't swear to you where she ended up beyond that. That country opens up wide once you're past the ridge, mining camps and worse besides. A woman could lose herself in that country for a long while if she had a mind to." Hargot had studied him for a long, cold moment, the particular assessing stare of a man who had caught liars before and was trying to decide whether this particular story held together under its own weight, and Caleb had held that stare without flinching, drawing on every hard year of controlling his own face over an anvil, of showing nothing to a piece of iron that might reveal an uncertain hand. And finally Hargot had grunted, a sound that carried more frustration than acceptance, and said, "We'll see about that, Whitmore," and had ridden off toward the North Edge lodging house with the deputy in tow, leaving Otis Draven still sitting his horse at a distance, watching Caleb with an expression of raw, undisguised hatred that told Caleb this particular danger was very far from over. It bought them roughly a week in the end, a week in which Hargot did indeed send riders northwest into the mining country to chase the false trail Caleb had offered, a week in which Emeline remained hidden at the Kessler line shack, growing steadily more restless and afraid in the enforced isolation, a week in which Caleb rode out to see her only every third night to avoid drawing suspicion, each visit shorter and more anxious than the one before. And it was on one of these visits, roughly midway through that borrowed week, that Emeline told Caleb something she had been turning over in her own mind in the long, solitary hours at the line shack, something that would come to matter more than either of them yet understood. "Caleb," she said, sitting close beside him in the small shack's single lamplight, "I have been thinking about Otis, about what he actually wants underneath all this hunting, and I think I understand something now that I didn't understand while I was still living under Silas's roof. Otis does not simply want to bring me back for justice. Whatever he tells himself, and whatever he tells Hargett, and whatever story gets told in whatever courtroom this eventually reaches. Otis wants a confession. He wants me to stand somewhere publicly and say that I murdered his brother in cold blood, because that is the only version of this story that lets Otis be the righteous avenger rather than the lesser brother chasing a dead man's ghost. If I simply disappear, if I am never found, Otis loses that story forever. And I think, God help me, that frightens him considerably more than the idea of me actually facing a fair trial somewhere, because a fair trial risks the truth coming out. My 2 years with Silas, the bruises, the particular expression on his face that final night, and Otis cannot afford that truth being heard any more than he can afford losing me to open country entirely. He needs me caught, and he needs me guilty, in exactly that order. And I do not think he much cares which comes first, as long as both eventually arrive. Caleb had turned that over carefully, feeling the shape of something forming in the back of his own mind, some strategy he had not yet fully articulated even to himself, and had said slowly, "Then perhaps what we need, Emeline, is not simply to keep hiding you until his money and his patience run out. Perhaps what we need is a way to make the truth impossible for him to bury, loud enough and public enough that even a corrupted sheriff and a grieving, prideful brother cannot simply wish it away or beat a false confession out of you in some back room 200 miles from anyone who'd stop them. If Otis Draven's whole purpose depends on nobody hearing the true story of what Silas actually was, then perhaps the answer isn't only to hide you from him forever. Perhaps part of the answer is making certain that if he ever does catch up to you, the truth is already standing there waiting for him, loud enough that his story can't survive contact with it." Emeline had looked at him with an expression caught between fear and something that might have been the first real hope she'd allowed herself in weeks, and said, "That is either the wisest thing anyone has said to me in this entire ordeal, Caleb Whitmore, or it is the single most dangerous plan I have ever heard, and I confess I cannot yet tell which." And Caleb had said, holding her hand tight in the lamplight, "Then let's spend what time we have left in this borrowed week figuring out which one it is, together, because I did not come this far only to keep you hidden in a line shack for the rest of your natural life, Emeline. I want a life with you that we can actually live out loud in daylight, on Bridge Street, in front of God, and this whole stubborn, decent little town that's already chosen to stand with us. I want that badly enough to risk trying for it, if you'll risk it with me." The plan that took shape over the following days was, in its essential design, simple enough to explain and considerably harder to execute. And it rested on a single piece of information Emeline had carried with her out of Texas without ever quite understanding its full value until Caleb asked her, directly, whether Silas Draven's cruelty had ever been witnessed by anyone beyond the walls of their own house. She had thought about it for a long while, sitting in the line shack's single lamplight, before answering slowly that there had been one occasion, 18 months back, when a hired girl named Constance Abelman had come to help with the spring cleaning and had walked in on the tail end of one of Silas's black moods, had seen, with her own eyes, the marks left on Emeline's arm the following morning, and had left the position within the week. Frightened, Emeline had always assumed, of being drawn into something dangerous, but had never, so far as Emeline knew, spoken of it to anyone in the 2 years since, out of the same fear that had kept Emeline herself silent, that no one would believe a servant girl's word against a celebrated marshal's either. If Constance Abelman could be found and could be persuaded to swear to what she'd seen, sworn testimony from a witness with no personal stake in Emeline's fate beyond simple honesty, would carry a weight that Emeline's own account, however true, could never carry alone in the eyes of a skeptical court or a hostile territorial judge inclined to favor a dead marshal's reputation over a fugitive wife's word. The difficulty, of course, was that Constance Abelman was somewhere in Texas, 200 miles and more from Larkspur Hollow, and reaching her, quietly, without alerting Otis Draven or Boone Hargett to the fact that a search was underway for exactly the kind of witness that could unravel their entire case, required someone Caleb trusted absolutely and who could travel that distance without drawing suspicion. It was Doc Ferris, in the end, who volunteered, explaining over supper at the smithy with a dry, self-deprecating humor that masked real courage, that he had a genuine professional reason to travel, a medical conference in Fort Worth he had been invited to twice before and declined both times, and that no one in Larkspur Hollow, least of all Otis Draven's party, would think twice about an aging country doctor taking a long overdue trip to hear the latest thinking on antiseptic practice from men who actually kept up with journals. "I'm no detective," Ferris admitted, "but I am considerably better at asking careful questions without alarming people than either of you two. Caleb, no offense meant, you've got an honest face that shows every thought crossing behind it, which is a fine quality in a husband and a poor one in a man trying to track down a frightened servant girl without spooking her further." Doc Ferris left within 2 days, ostensibly for his long-postponed medical conference, and the waiting that followed, nearly 3 weeks in total, stretched every nerve in the small circle of Emeline's protectors to a thinness that Caleb would later describe as the hardest patience he had ever been asked to hold, harder even than the 3 years of grief that preceded it. Because grief, at least, asked nothing further of him, while this waiting asked him to keep functioning, to keep the forge running, to keep appearances steady in front of a town that watched him now with a mixture of quiet sympathy and quiet suspicion, while Boone Hargett's men continued their increasingly frustrated search of the surrounding country, and Otis Draven grew, by all reports reaching Caleb through Toby and Agatha, more volatile and less patient with every fruitless week. It was during this waiting period that the story's first true betrayal occurred, and it came, as such things often do, from a direction none of them had properly guarded against. Frank Dunmore, the livery owner whose desperate finances had once made him a genuine risk, had indeed held firm after Agatha's subscription eased his burden. But his young nephew, a restless 20-year-old named Judd Dunmore, who worked odd jobs around the livery and had none of his uncle's hard-won gratitude toward the town, had overheard, quite by accident, a conversation between Caleb and Elias regarding the Kessler Ranch and Doc Ferris's true errand in Texas. And Judd, tempted by Otis Draven's still-standing reward and unburdened by any particular loyalty to a town he'd always found dull and unrewarding, had ridden out to the North Edge lodging house late one night and sold what he'd overheard for $150. Considerably less than the full reward, but to a restless young man with no ties holding him to Larkspur Hollow's slower rhythms, apparently some enough. Caleb learned of the betrayal only after the fact, and only by accident, when Toby, running an errand past the livery 2 mornings later, overheard Frank Dunmore in a furious, grief-stricken argument with his own nephew, loud enough to carry into the street, in which the older man called the younger every hard name a decent uncle could summon for a betrayal that deep. And Toby, understanding at once what he was hearing, had run the 5 miles to the smithy at a dead sprint to warn Caleb before the news could travel any further. The warning arrived, as it turned out, perhaps 6 hours too late. Boone Hargett and Otis Draven, along with the 2 remaining men of their original party, rode for the Kessler Ranch that same night, under cover of darkness, moving with none of the leisurely, overconfident pace they'd shown on their first arrival in town. And it was only the Kesslers' own dogs, restless and barking at strange riders on their land well past midnight, that gave Manny and Louisa even the small warning they had. Enough time for Manny to fire a rifle shot into the air to alert the line shack a half-mile distant, a signal he and Caleb had arranged weeks before against exactly this possibility, before Hargett's party could reach the shack itself. Caleb, who had ridden out to the ranch that same evening for one of his now rare visits, was still at the line shack when Manny's warning shot cracked across the dark ranch land, and he and Emeline had perhaps 4 minutes, by his later reckoning, between that shot and the sound of approaching horses, 4 minutes in which every plan they had carefully built over the preceding weeks collapsed down into a single, desperate improvisation. There's a dry wash a quarter-mile east, running toward the old mining trail, Caleb said, already moving, pulling Emeline's coat from its hook, checking, with hands that shook only slightly, the small pistol he had begun keeping at the line shack against exactly this eventuality. Manny showed it to me weeks back, says it's easy walking if you know the turns, and near impossible to track a horse through in the dark. You go now. On foot, you hear me, Emeline, on foot, because a horse leaves tracks a man like Hargett will read easy even by lantern light, and you keep to that wash until it meets the old mine road, and you wait there, in the collapsed entrance of the Sadler claim. Manny knows it. He'll come for you himself once these men are dealt with here. And you, Emeline had said, already moving toward the door but turning back, her voice tight with a fear that was— Caleb understood even in that frantic moment, not fear for herself, but fear for him. And Caleb, no time left for anything but the plainest truth, had said, I'm going to be standing right here when they arrive, Emeline, because if this shack is empty and no one saw you leave it, there's a chance, a real chance, that I can make them believe you were never here at all tonight, that Manny's shot was nothing but a coyote spooking the stock, and that buys you the time you need to reach that mine claim. Clean. Go. Now. I love you, and I intend to still be standing here to tell you that again once this night is done, so don't you dare slow your feet worrying about me instead of running. She had gone then, out the back of the line shack and into the dark toward the dry wash, and Caleb had forced his own breathing steady, banked the shack's small stove down low, the way a man settling in for an ordinary night's sleep might, and had been sitting, apparently at ease, on the shack's single narrow cot with a lantern turned low, when Boone Hargett's party arrived at the door not 4 minutes later, Otis Draven in the lead this time, pistol already drawn, kicking the door open with none of the careful legal patience he'd shown back in town. Where is she? Otis had demanded, sweeping the small shack's interior with his lantern, finding it plainly, undeniably empty but for Caleb himself, sitting up now with the exaggerated sleep-heavy confusion of a man rudely woken, and Caleb had said, slow, deliberately thick, with feigned drowsiness, Where's who, exactly, and what in the hell do you gentlemen think you're doing kicking in a rancher's line shack at this hour? Because Manny Kessler is going to have considerably more to say to you about trespassing than I do, and I'd wager his shotgun says it louder than his voice will. Otis had crossed the small room in 2 furious strides and grabbed Caleb by the front of his shirt, hauling him half up off the cot, and had said, low and vicious, "Don't you play the fool with me, Whitmore? We know she was here. We've known for weeks you've been riding out to this exact ranch every few nights. Don't tell me you've been coming all this way just to admire Manny Kessler's cattle." And Caleb, keeping his own voice as steady as he could manage with a furious man's fist twisted in his collar, had said, "I've been courting the Kesslers' hired housekeeper, if you must know, a widow named Louisa's cousin helping out this season, and I'd thank you to let go of my shirt before this conversation gets a good deal less civil than it's been so far, because you're on private land without a warrant covering it, same as you were reminded once already back in town. It was, in the end, Boone Hargett, cooler-headed even in his own frustration, who pulled Otis back, muttering something about not wanting a second incident that could be used against them in whatever court this eventually reached, and the search of the small shack that followed, thorough but hampered by genuine emptiness, turned up nothing beyond the ordinary provisions of a working ranch's line shack, no woman's belongings, nothing to contradict Caleb's hastily improvised story, and Hargett, standing in the doorway afterward with his cold eyes fixed on Caleb in open, simmering suspicion, had said, finally, "We didn't find her here tonight, Whitmore. I'll grant you that much. But somebody fired a rifle shot not 10 minutes before we arrived, and I don't believe for 1 second that was a coyote. And I think you know exactly where she went when she heard it, and I think this is the last night I'm inclined to be gentle about finding out." They had ridden back toward the main ranch house then, presumably to press Manny and Louisa with the same suspicion, and Caleb, alone in the small shack with his heart still hammering, had allowed himself exactly 30 seconds of pure, shaking relief before forcing himself back into motion, because Emeline was still out there alone in the dark, and the night, he understood with grim certainty, was very far from over. Caleb found Manny waiting for him at the fork where the dry wash met the old mining trail, having slipped away from his own ranch house under cover of tending to what he'd told Hargett's men was a spooked and injured heifer, and together they made their way in careful silence up the old mine road toward the collapsed entrance of the Sadler claim, a played-out silver dig abandoned a decade back and left to the slow work of weather and rockfall, its entrance now half choked with fallen timber that made it look, from any distance, like nothing more than an ordinary scar in the hillside. They found Emeline pressed back into the shallow space behind the collapsed timbers, cold and shaking and gripping the small pistol Caleb had given her with both hands. And when Caleb's low voice called her name in the dark, she'd made a sound that was half sob, half fierce, relieved laugh, and had come out into his arms so fast she nearly knocked him off his feet, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply held on while Manny stood a discreet few yards off, keeping watch down the trail. "They can't find us here, can they?" Emeline had finally managed, still shaking, and Caleb had said, "Not tonight, not this trail, but Emeline, I won't lie to you. Otis Draven is not a man who gives up after one failed search, and Hargett suspects considerably more than he can currently prove, which in my experience makes a corrupt man more dangerous, not less, because a man who can't get what he wants through the law starts looking for ways to get it outside the law instead. We need to move you again, somewhere they haven't thought to look yet, and we need Doc Ferris to find what he's looking for in Texas faster than either of us has any right to expect, because I don't know how many more nights like this one we can survive on pure improvisation and Manny's rifle shots." The new hiding place settled on within that same desperate night was a location none of Otis Draven's party had any reason to suspect, the small root cellar beneath the Larkspur Hollow Chapel itself, a space Elias Cobb had used for years to store preserved goods for the town's Poor Relief Fund, and which he now offered, without a moment's hesitation, as the safest ground remaining to them precisely because it was the one place in the entire county that a lawman, however corrupt, would think twice about violating without overwhelming cause, the specific, old-fashioned reluctance even hardened men sometimes carried toward the physical space of a church. It is not sanctuary in the old legal sense, not anymore, not on this frontier, Elias had explained to Caleb and Emeline both once they'd reached the chapel in the small hours before dawn, but it is sanctuary in every sense that actually matters. And I will stand in that doorway myself and remind Sheriff Hargett, in front of whatever witnesses I can gather, exactly what kind of story gets told about a man who drags a frightened woman out of a house of worship at gunpoint, because even a corrupted badge has to answer, eventually, to public opinion. And there is no faster way to lose whatever thin legal cover Hargett still enjoys than to be seen violating a church. The days that followed were the tensest of the entire ordeal, Emeline hidden now in the chapel's cramped root cellar, emerging only after full dark and only into Elias's own small quarters behind the sanctuary, while above ground the confrontation between the town and Otis Draven's party sharpened towards something that felt, to everyone involved, like it could not possibly hold much longer. Hargett, having failed twice now to find his quarry despite mounting evidence she remained somewhere in the vicinity, grew openly hostile in his dealings with Larkspur Hollow's residents, and Otis Draven, his patience and his composure both fraying visibly with each passing day, began making threats in the North Edge lodging house loud enough that word of them traveled through town within hours, threats against Caleb specifically, against anyone found to be aiding what Otis now called, in his cups, that murdering woman and every fool in this town, too blind or too bribed to see her for what she is. It was into this gathering storm that Doc Ferris finally returned, 19 days after his departure, riding into Larkspur Hollow on a lathered horse in the gray light of early morning, with an expression Caleb read from clear across Bridge Street as the specific look of a man carrying something that mattered enormously. And Ferris had gone straight to the smithy without even seeing to his own horse's care first, a lapse so unlike the meticulous old doctor that Caleb understood, before a single word was spoken, that the news, whatever it was significant. "I found her," Ferris said, still catching his breath. "Constance Abelman, married now. Goes by Constance Whaley, living in a little town called Denton, not 30 miles from Cross Timbers. And Caleb, she has been carrying this for 2 years the same way Emeline has, frightened to speak it, certain no one would believe a hired girl's word against a marshal's reputation. And when I finally convinced her that Emeline was alive and in genuine danger of being dragged back to face a fabricated murder charge, she did not hesitate for 1 second. She gave me a full sworn statement, notarized by a Denton magistrate willing to put his own name to it, describing exactly what she witnessed 18 months back. The state Emeline was in, the morning after that particular incident, bruising consistent with a beating, her own direct observation of Silas Draven's temper on more than one occasion during her employment. And Caleb, there is more. Once word got out quietly, carefully, that someone was finally asking these questions, 2 more women came forward on their own. Women from Cross Timbers who had likewise seen or suspected the truth of that marriage, and had likewise stayed silent out of the same fear Emeline and Constance both carried. I have 3 sworn statements now, Caleb, not one, describing a pattern of cruelty stretching back the better part of 2 years. And I have something else besides, something I did not expect to find at all. And the something else, Ferris explained, settling at last into a chair with the exhausted relief of a man laying down a burden carried a very long way, was a letter discovered among Silas Draven's effects by his own housekeeper in the confused weeks after his death, and kept, out of a servant's instinctive caution, rather than destroyed or handed over, a letter Silas had written, but apparently never sent, addressed to a friend back east, in which the dead marshal had described in his own hand, with a chilling, matter-of-fact casualness, his growing frustration with his wife's continued survival of what he called, in his own words, the discipline she requires to remember her place, language that, taken together with the sworn statements of 3 separate witnesses, painted a picture no honest court in the territory could easily dismiss as the fabrication of a frightened, guilty woman. This does not make the shooting itself simply disappear as a legal matter, Ferris cautioned, watching Caleb's face carefully. A man is still dead, and there will still need to be some manner of formal accounting for that fact in front of a proper judge. But Caleb, this changes everything about what story gets told in that accounting. This is no longer simply Emeline Rourke's word against a dead hero's reputation. This is documented, witnessed, corroborated cruelty stretching back 2 years, met finally with a single desperate act of self-defense on the one night that cruelty turned lethal. I have shown early copies of these statements carefully to a territorial judge in Denton, whose reputation I trust, a man named Ashworth, and Judge Ashworth has agreed, on the strength of what I've shown him, to hear Emeline's case personally in a properly convened hearing, rather than allowing Otis Draven and Sheriff Hargett to simply drag her back to Texas under whatever informal arrangement they'd prefer. He is prepared to ride to Larkspur Hollow himself within the week to convene that hearing on neutral ground, provided we can guarantee Emeline's safety and presence until he arrives. The relief that swept through the small gathered circle at the smithy that morning, Caleb and Elias and Agatha all present by the time Ferris finished his account, was profound but carefully, deliberately incomplete, because every soul in that room understood that Otis Draven, informed of a coming legal hearing that threatened to expose his brother's true character before the entire territory, was unlikely to simply accept that outcome quietly, and that the days remaining before Judge Ashworth's arrival represented, if anything, the single most dangerous stretch of the entire ordeal. A cornered, desperate man's last opportunity to settle matters his own way before the law. He'd been so carelessly bending, finally caught up with his own conduct. "We tell no one outside this room," Elias said gravely. "Not yet. Not until Judge Ashworth is actually here. And this hearing is a fact rather than a plan, because if Otis Draven learns what's coming before it arrives, I fear considerably more for what he might attempt than I do for what a fair hearing will conclude." And Caleb, echoing a thought he suspected every person in that room was already turning over privately, had said, "Then we keep Emeline exactly where she is, safest ground we have, and we wait, and we pray these last days pass quieter than the ones behind us. Though I confess I have very little faith left at this point in quiet. The quiet Caleb had prayed for lasted exactly 4 days, and it was broken not by any further betrayal from within the town, but by Otis Draven's own mounting desperation, which had, by the 5th night after Doc Ferris's return, curdled into something considerably more dangerous than the cold, patient hunting he and Hargett had practiced through the preceding weeks. Toby, running his usual evening errand past the North Edge lodging house to gauge the temperature of the town's unwelcome guests, as had become his quiet, self-appointed habit, came pounding on the smithy's door well past dark with a look on his face that told Caleb, before the boy managed a single word, that whatever calm remained had just run out entirely. "Mr. Whitmore!" Toby gasped. "Otis Draven's drunk as I've ever seen a man, shouting in the saloon about how he knows she's still in this town, how he knows this whole place has been lying to his face for weeks, and he was saying, loud enough half the street could hear it, that if the law in this territory won't help him finish what needs finishing, he'll finish it himself, tonight. Starting with burning every building on Bridge Street to the ground until she comes out of whichever one she's hiding in, rather than watch this whole town burn on her account." Sheriff Hargett was trying to quiet him down, but Mr. Whitmore, Otis shook him off, and he's gathering the other 2 men, and I truly think, he means every word of it. Caleb had felt the specific, terrible clarity that comes to a man in the instant, a long-feared danger. Finally, fully arrives, and had moved fast, sending Toby running for Elias and Agatha, both while he himself headed at a dead run for the chapel, understanding with grim certainty that whatever Otis Draven intended, he would come first and most violently for the one building in Larkspur Hollow most likely to actually be sheltering the woman he'd spent weeks hunting, and that Elias's carefully calculated gamble on the moral weight of a church's walls might, against a man too far gone in drink and grief and wounded pride to care any longer for public opinion, simply fail to hold. He reached the chapel to find Elias already there, having heard some version of the same warning from a different direction, and Emeline emerging from the root cellar's hidden entrance, with her face set in an expression Caleb had not seen from her before. Not fear exactly, or not only fear, but something harder and more resolved sitting alongside it. And when she spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that surprised him even in the urgency of the moment. "I am done running, Caleb," she said. "I have run for 2 months now, and I watched you nearly lose your standing in this town, and I watched Manny and Louisa risk their whole ranch, and I have hidden in a root cellar like something to be ashamed of, and I am done with all of it. If Otis Draven means to burn this town looking for me, then he is not going to find me hiding one moment longer, while good people who never did anything except show me kindness pay the price for my fear. I am going to walk out onto that street and face him myself tonight, in front of whatever part of this town is willing to stand and watch, because I would rather face him honestly than watch one more person bleed for my sake in the dark." Caleb had wanted, in that instant, More than he had wanted almost anything in his life, to simply forbid it, to lock her back in that root cellar and stand in the doorway himself the way he'd stood in his own doorway that very first rainy night. But he looked at her face, at the specific hard-won resolve sitting there, the resolve of a woman who had spent 2 years being told her fear and her survival were both, somehow, shameful things to be hidden, and he understood, with a clarity that cost him something to accept, that taking this choice away from her now would be its own small betrayal of everything he claimed to love about her. "Then you don't walk out there alone," he said. "Not for one single step of it. Whatever you're walking into, I'm walking into it standing beside you, and so is Elias, and I'd wager the better part of this town besides. Because I don't think Otis Draven has the first idea what he's about to ride into if he thinks Larkspur Hollow is going to simply hand you over out of fear." What followed, in the space of perhaps 20 frantic minutes, was a mustering of the town that Caleb would remember for the rest of his life as the single proudest thing he ever witnessed Larkspur Hollow do. Elias rang the chapel bell, the old cracked bell he'd once asked Caleb to repair the mount for, an alarm signal the town understood from occasional practice drills against prairie fire, and within minutes lanterns began appearing up and down Bridge Street, doors opening, figures emerging into the cold night. Agatha Prescott arriving first with a shotgun she plainly knew how to use, followed by Manny and Louisa Kessler, having ridden in at a gallop the moment Toby's warning reached their ranch, followed by Doc Ferris, by Ezra Voss from the Mercantile, by old Ferris Dunbar the cattleman, by a dozen and then 24 other faces Caleb had known his whole life. Ordinary townsfolk, farmers and shopkeepers and their wives, gathering on Bridge Street in the cold dark with lanterns, and in a fair number of cases their own weapons, not out of any appetite for violence, but out of the plain, settled resolve of a town that had decided, together, weeks before, exactly what kind of people they intended to be when this night finally arrived. Otis Draven and his 2 remaining men, Boone Hargett trailing behind them with an expression that had shifted, Caleb noted even in the tension of the moment, from confident menace to something considerably more uncertain, rode on to Bridge Street to find not an empty, frightened town, but nearly 40 of its residents gathered in the lamplight and lantern glow, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the chapel steps, and at the center of that gathering, not hidden, not cowering, Emeline Rourke herself, standing beside Caleb Whitmore with her chin lifted and her eyes steady, facing down the men who had hunted her across 200 miles of open country. "There she is," Otis said, his voice slurred with drink and shaking with something that was equal parts triumph and barely controlled rage, swinging down off his horse with a hand already on his pistol. "There's the murdering bitch who shot my brother in cold blood and ran like the coward she's always been, and I don't care how many of you fools have decided to stand around her tonight. She's coming back to Texas with me one way or another. And any man foolish enough to stand between me and that is going to answer to this pistol same as she's about to." It was Elias Cobb who stepped forward first, unarmed, his black coat and collar catching the lantern light, and said in a voice that carried clear and steady across the gathered crowd, "Otis Draven, you are standing in front of a house of God, threatening violence against a woman and against an entire town of witnesses. And before you draw that pistol on anyone here tonight, I would ask you to consider very carefully what story gets told about this moment afterward, because there are now near 40 souls standing on this street who will swear, every one of them, to exactly what they saw here. And I do not believe that is a story you actually want told in whatever courtroom eventually hears it. There's no court coming, preacher," Otis snarled. "Not for 2 more weeks by the fastest rider. And I don't intend to wait 2 more weeks standing around this backwater town while you all protect a murderer." And it was in that exact moment, with Otis Draven's hand tightening on his pistol and the gathered crowd going utterly still with held breath, that the sound of an approaching rider, hard-driven and urgent, cut through the tense night air from the southern road, and every head on Bridge Street turned to see a lathered horse come pounding into town at a dead gallop, its rider calling out even before he'd fully reined in a voice Caleb recognized with a fierce, sudden surge of hope as belonging to the territorial deputy who had originally delivered Hargot's warrant. "Judge Ashworth is 2 miles behind me," the deputy called, drawing his horse up hard in front of the assembled crowd, "sent me ahead to announce his arrival on account of urgent business concerning a hearing into the death of Marshal Silas Draven and Sheriff Hargot. I've got papers here you'll want to see before anyone on this street does one more thing tonight that can't be taken back afterward, because the judge has already reviewed sworn statements from 3 witnesses in Texas, along with a letter in the dead marshal's own hand, and he has ordered, in the strongest possible terms, that Mrs. Rourke's safety be guaranteed pending a proper hearing, and that any man found to have threatened her or this town through violence in the meantime will answer for it personally, badge or no badge." The effect of those words on Boone Hargot was immediate and, to Caleb's eye, almost comically visible, the heavy-set sheriff's cold composure collapsing into something close to panic as the specific legal ground he had been so carefully, corruptly bending for weeks suddenly shifted beneath him, a territorial judge's direct order being an altogether different, considerably more dangerous thing to be caught defying than a small town's stubborn resistance had ever been, and Hargot had grabbed Otis Draven's arm hard and said, low and urgent, "Otis, put it away. Now, tonight. Before you do something in front of 40 witnesses and a judge's own deputy that neither one of us can walk back from, because I did not sign on for a hanging offense. I signed on for a bounty, and this just stopped being worth the money." Otis Draven had stood there for a long, terrible moment, pistol still half drawn, his drink-fogged eyes moving from the deputy to the gathered crowd to Emeline herself, standing steady beside Caleb with an expression that held, Caleb saw, not triumph, but something closer to grief, the grief of a woman watching the last dangerous echo of a marriage that had nearly killed her finally, visibly, running out of road, and something in that expression, or perhaps simply the cold arithmetic of 40 armed witnesses and an approaching territorial judge, finally broke through whatever drunken resolve had carried Otis this far, and his hand came away from the pistol, slow, shaking, and he said in a voice gone suddenly hollow, "This isn't over," and Emeline, finding her own voice at last, steady despite everything, had said, "It is over, Otis. It has been over since the night your brother raised that pistol against me first. I am sorry for your grief. I have never once stopped being sorry for it, but I will not carry the blame for a story that was never true, not for you, not for anyone, not one day longer." In the 2 days between that tense standoff on Bridge Street and Judge Ashworth's formal hearing in the chapel, Larkspur Hollow existed in a strange, suspended quiet, the particular held-breath stillness of a town that has weathered a storm but has not yet been told, officially, that the storm has fully passed. Caleb spent those 2 days scarcely leaving Emeline's side, and it was during this brief, precious interlude that Toby Lang came to him with a request that Caleb would remember long afterward as one of the quieter but more meaningful moments of that entire difficult season. "Mr. Whitmore," the boy said, finding Caleb alone in the smithy on the second morning, turning a scrap of iron over in his hands with the particular nervousness of someone working up courage for a request that mattered to him, "I've been thinking on it. And I want to ask you something, and I'd understand if you said no on account of everything else going on, but I didn't want to let the asking wait any longer than it already has." "Ask it," Caleb had said, setting down his own work, giving the boy his full attention in a way he had learned over 2 years Toby particularly needed when something weighed on him. "I want you to teach me the trade proper," Toby said, all in a rush now that he'd started. "Not just fetching and carrying and banking fires, which I don't mind doing, but the real work, the shaping and the tempering and the fine joint work you do on the good commissions. My pa's been gone 2 years now, and I know he'd have wanted me learning something with my hands that could keep my ma fed proper. And there ain't a finer smith in this whole county than you. Everybody says so. And I've watched you these 2 years not just doing the work but doing right by people. Doing right by Miss Emeline when it would have been a sight easier and safer to turn her away. And I want to learn to be that kind of man. Mr. Whitmore, not just that kind of smith. I want you to teach me both, if you'll have me." Caleb had felt something catch in his own chest at that, a feeling not unlike the one that had opened in him the night he first caught Emeline in the rain, and he had said slowly, "Toby, I have been meaning to have exactly this conversation with you myself, and been putting it off because there's been considerably more urgent trouble occupying my attention these last weeks than I'd like. You've had the makings of a fine smith in you since the day your mother first brought you round here 2 years back, scared half to death and trying not to show it, and you've more than proven, these last 2 months especially, that you've got the harder trade in you too, the trade of standing by people when it costs you something to do it. I would be proud, more than proud, to teach you everything my own father taught me, and I expect within a few years you'll be putting my own workmanship to shame, which is exactly the way it's supposed to go. A good teacher, raising up someone better than himself. Toby's mother, Ruth Lang, had come to the smithy herself later that same week, once the immediate danger had passed and the town's attention had turned toward the coming hearing, and had thanked Caleb with a directness that left him faintly embarrassed, telling him that she had watched her son grow these 2 years, from a frightened, grieving boy into someone she scarcely recognized as the same child, steadier, prouder of himself, carrying himself now the way his own father used to before the mine took him. And she said, "Caleb, whatever else comes of all this trouble with the Draven business, I want you to know my boy got something out of these 2 months that I don't think he'd have gotten any other way. Watching a grown man do the hard right thing when the easy wrong thing was sitting right there for the taking. That's worth more to a boy his age than any wage you could pay him, though I notice you've been paying him a fair wage too, which I haven't forgotten either." It was Agatha Prescott, in that same suspended stretch of days, who took it upon herself to sit with Emeline privately, away from the gathering crowds and the mounting legal preparations, and to say something Emeline would carry with her, she told Caleb afterward, for the rest of her life. Agatha had come to the chapel's small back room where Emeline was staying, bringing a plate of food neither one of them much cared about, and had simply sat with her a while in comfortable silence before saying, "Emeline, I want to tell you something before this hearing happens, before the judge says whatever he's going to say, because I don't want you to hear it for the first time only after everyone's already decided you deserve to hear it. I have watched a great many people pass through this town in 11 years running that boarding house," Agatha had said, "and I have learned to tell, fairly quick, which ones are simply passing through and which ones are going to matter to this place for good. You matter to this place now, Emeline, whatever that judge decides in 2 days' time. You mattered to it the first night Caleb told me the truth of your situation, and I watched a man I've known since he was a boy decide, without a moment's hesitation, that your safety was worth more to him than his own comfortable, careful little life. You mattered to it every single day since, watching this whole stubborn town decide, one soul at a time, that we were not going to be the kind of place that hands a frightened woman over for $500, just because it would have been easier. Whatever you've survived to get here, and I know it was considerable, you did not survive it to become some sad story people tell with pity in their voices. You survived it to become exactly what you are right now, sitting in front of me, a woman who is going to walk into that hearing and tell the truth in her own voice, in front of a whole town that already believes her. And I want you to walk in there knowing that, not hoping for it. Emeline had wept at that quietly and had told Agatha when she could speak again that she had spent 2 years believing herself fundamentally alone in the world. Her father dead, her sister too distant and too frightened of her own married life to be relied upon, and that the strangest, most unexpected gift of this whole terrible ordeal had been discovering, in a town she'd stumbled into purely by exhausted accident, something she had stopped believing still existed anywhere, a community of people willing to risk something real for a stranger's sake, simply because it was the right thing to do and no other reason at all. That is not an accident of this particular town, Agatha had told her, though I'll admit we're prouder of it than most. That is simply what decent people look like when enough of them decide together to be decent at the same time instead of waiting for someone else to go first. You'll find it in other places too, Emeline, if you ever have cause to look for it again, though I hope to God you never again find yourself in circumstances that require the looking. But I wanted you to know, before that judge says his piece, that the verdict that actually matters most in this whole affair was already decided, weeks ago, by ordinary people in an ordinary little town, and it was decided in your favor a long time before any judge wrote into it. Judge Ashworth arrived in Larkspur Hollow 2 hours later than his deputy had promised, delayed by a lamed horse on the southern road, and found a town still gathered on Bridge Street in the cold dark, having refused almost to the last soul to disperse until the matter was settled beyond any further doubt, and Caleb would remember, for years afterward, the specific sight of Judge Ashworth stepping down from his carriage into that lantern-lit crowd, a tall, silver-haired man with the unhurried gravity of someone who had spent 30 years learning to read a room before he ever opened his mouth in it, and the way the whole gathered town had gone quiet, almost reverent at his arrival, the particular hush of people who understood that something important was finally, actually about to be decided by someone with the standing to decide it properly. The hearing itself was convened 2 days later, not in any grand courtroom, Larkspur Hollow possessing nothing of the kind, but in the chapel itself, Elias Cobb's small sanctuary pressed into unlikely service as a hall of justice, its modest pews filled to capacity with townsfolk who had, by now, adopted Emeline's cause as thoroughly as their own, and Judge Ashworth presided from behind a borrowed table at the front of the room with a patience and a thoroughness that Caleb found himself grateful for with every passing hour, because a lesser man, he understood, might have rushed such proceedings toward whatever conclusion seemed most convenient, and Ashworth rushed nothing. Constance Whaley, born Abelman, had traveled up from Texas herself in the 2 weeks since Doc Ferris's departure, arriving 3 days before the hearing with a courage Emeline described afterward as more moving than almost anything else in the entire ordeal. A woman who had spent 2 years frightened into silence, choosing, finally, to stand in a strange town and speak the truth she'd carried so long in front of a room full of strangers. She testified with a steady, careful voice about what she had witnessed 18 months before, the bruising, the fear in Emeline's manner in the days that followed, Silas Draven's temper on more than one occasion during her brief employment in that household, and when Otis Draven, present at the hearing under the judge's own order, attempted twice to interrupt her testimony with furious objections, Judge Ashworth silenced him both times with a single cold word and a look that Caleb suspected had quelled considerably more powerful men than a grieving, disgraced deputy over the course of 30 years on the bench. The letter, Silas Draven's own unsent words describing his wife's continued survival of what he called the discipline she requires, was read into the record by Judge Ashworth himself in a flat, careful voice that nonetheless carried, Caleb thought, more condemnation in its plainness than any amount of dramatic outrage could have managed. And he watched the color drain from more than a few faces in the gathered crowd as the words landed, watched Agatha Prescott's jaw tighten to iron, watched even Boone Hargett, present now not as an enforcer but as a witness, compelled to explain his own conduct, look away from the letter's reading with an expression that might, in a better man, have been shame. Emeline herself testified last, and Caleb, watching from the third pew beside Elias and Agatha, felt his chest tighten with a fierce, protective pride as she recounted, in the same steady, unflinching voice she had used to tell him the story that first terrible night above the forge, The full 2 years of her marriage, the small daily calculations of survival, the specific expression on Silas Draven's face in the final moment before the pistol discharged, an expression she described exactly as she had described it to Caleb weeks before. And when she finished, Judge Ashworth had been quiet for a long moment, studying her across the small chapel, before he said, "Mrs. Rourke, I have sat on this bench for the better part of 3 decades, and I have heard a great many accounts of violence between husband and wife in that time, some true, some considerably less true than the party telling them believed. I want you to know that I do not say what I am about to say lightly, nor without having weighed the corroborating testimony of 2 additional witnesses whose sworn statements Dr. Ferris also secured, women who came forward independently and at real risk to themselves. I find, based on the whole of the evidence before this hearing, that the death of Marshal Silas Draven occurred as a direct result of his own violent assault against his wife, that Mrs. Rourke's actions in that moment constitute lawful self-defense under any reasonable reading of the law of this territory or the state of Texas both, and that no further legal action shall be pursued against her in this matter, in this jurisdiction or any other, so long as I hold the authority to say so." The chapel had erupted in that instant into a sound Caleb had never heard within those walls before, not the ordinary decorous applause of a town hearing good news politely, but something closer to a roar. Townsfolk rising to their feet, Agatha weeping openly and without a shred of embarrassment, Manny Kessler's broad hand clapping so hard against Caleb's shoulder it nearly knocked him from the pew, and at the center of it, Emeline Rourke standing at the front of the small chapel with tears streaming freely down her face for the first time. Caleb realized, since he had first found her crying quietly in his own upstairs room 2 months before, except that these tears carried nothing of that first grief. These were the tears, purely and simply, of a woman finally, fully believed. Otis Draven had left Larkspur Hollow the following morning, alone, Boone Hargett having quietly resigned whatever remained of his corrupted authority rather than face the territorial inquiry Judge Ashworth had promised to initiate into his own conduct during the search, and Caleb, watching Otis ride out of town from the smithy's doorway, had felt, to his own surprise, something closer to sorrow than triumph at the sight, understanding that whatever else Otis Draven had done, he had also lost a brother, however monstrous that brother had become, and had spent 2 months chasing a story that could never have given him back what he'd actually lost. And Caleb thought, watching him go, that some men simply never learned to grieve honestly, choosing instead to build their sorrow into a weapon and swing it at whoever stood nearest, and that Otis Draven would likely spend the rest of his days paying for that choice in ways considerably harder than any courtroom could have sentenced him to. The town of Larkspur Hollow, in the weeks that followed, settled back into something resembling its ordinary rhythm, though everyone who had stood on Bridge Street that cold night agreed, in the quiet way such things get agreed upon without ever being formally discussed, that the town itself had changed in some fundamental way, had discovered something about its own character that would not soon be forgotten, and Frank Dunmore, the livery owner whose desperate finances had once made him a genuine risk, was seen in the months that followed going considerably out of his way to make amends for his nephew Judd's betrayal, though Judd himself had left the county entirely within a week of the hearing, unable, by all accounts, to bear the weight of his neighbor's quiet, unforgiving disappointment. Caleb and Emeline were married the following spring, in the same small chapel that had sheltered her through the worst of the danger. Elias Cobb, presiding with a joy, Caleb suspected the young pastor had been anticipating for months before either of them had quite worked up the courage to set a date, and the whole of Larkspur Hollow turned out for the occasion, Agatha Prescott weeping again, unashamed, in the front pew, Manny and Louisa Kessler bringing enough food from their own ranch to feed the entire gathering twice over, Toby standing at Caleb's side as the closest thing to a best man the young apprentice had ever been asked to be, beaming with a pride that made Caleb's own chest ache with something warm and grateful. Emeline moved fully into the rooms above the forge that had first sheltered her, and together she and Caleb transformed them, over that first year of marriage, into something that Caleb found himself thinking of more and more often as simply home again, the particular ordinary miracle of a house that had sat quiet and careful for 3 years, finally filling back up with noise and warmth and the specific, unrepeatable sound of two people building a life together on purpose, rather than simply enduring one alone. Emeline took over the Smithies ledgers entirely within that first year, transforming Caleb's chicken-scratch bookkeeping into something considerably closer to order, and she became, in time, something of a fixture in Larkspur Hollow's own quiet civic life, working alongside Agatha in the town's charitable efforts and speaking on occasion, when asked, with a careful, deliberate honesty about her own history, understanding that her story, difficult as it had been to live through, might yet serve some other frightened woman somewhere as proof that survival and eventually even happiness remained possible on the far side of exactly the kind of darkness she had lived through. Caleb never did clear out every trace of Sarah from those rooms, and Emeline, understanding this without needing it explained, never asked him to. And there was room, they both discovered, in a heart that had once believed itself permanently closed against further loss, for both a grief long carried and a love newly found, the two existing side by side rather than in competition, the way two different seasons of the same good land can each, in their turn, bring forth their own particular harvest. On the anniversary of that first rainy night each year, Caleb and Emeline walked together to the small cemetery on the hill above the chapel and stood for a while at Sarah's grave, and Emeline had told him, the first time they did this, that she did not consider it strange or difficult to stand there beside him, because she understood, better than most, what it cost a person to love fully after loss. And she considered it, she said, a kind of honor to be trusted with that particular, ongoing tenderness rather than asked to erase it. Doc Ferris in his later years was fond of telling the story of that whole ordeal to anyone who'd sit still long enough to hear the whole of it, always ending with the same observation, delivered with the particular dry satisfaction of a man who had played his own quiet, essential part in a larger rescue. It wasn't one man's courage that saved that woman, he would say, though God knows Caleb Whitmore showed more of it than I'd have credited him with beforehand. It was a whole town deciding, together, one stubborn soul at a time, that a frightened woman's life was worth more than $500 and considerably more than their own comfortable silence. And I have never in all my years practicing medicine in that county seen a finer proof of what people are actually capable of when they decide, plainly and together, what kind of place they want to live in. And on quiet evenings, years later, when the forge fire had banked down low and the rooms above it were warm with lamplight and the particular contented noise of a marriage grown comfortable in its own skin, Emeline would sometimes ask Caleb, half teasing, whether he had truly known, that first rainy night, catching a stranger with blood on her skirt and fear in her eyes, that his whole life was about to change, and Caleb would always answer the same way, drawing her close in the lamplight of the home they had built together out of danger and stubbornness and a whole town's stubborn decency. "I knew something had changed the instant I caught you," he'd say. "I didn't know yet what it would cost either one of us to keep it. I only knew, standing there in the rain with you in my arms and my whole careful, empty life suddenly cracking open around me, that I was done being safe, if being safe meant being alone, and that whatever came next, however hard it turned out to be, I wanted to face it with you standing beside me rather than face nothing at all, standing safely by myself. That was worth more to me than any peace I'd built without you in it, Emeline, from that very first night. And it has been worth more to me every single day since, and I expect it will go on being worth more to me for every day I've got left to live."